Okay, why don't we begin? It's 10:31. I know a few more people are going to pop in as we proceed. So day two of the conference. Thank you everyone for being here. For some people it's early, for some people it's late, but we very much appreciate that you came. It was of course a disappointment to all of us here at NYU that we couldn't host you in person. So again, on behalf of the Development Research Institute, CB Starr Center for Applied Economics and the Department of Economics, we're happy to host the conference. I'm going to in fact turn it over to our first, well actually let me of course thank, I can't thank often enough the DRI staff and our graduate student volunteers that have kept things going seamlessly and in the background. So thanks to all of them. So actually with that, I'm just going to mention just the basic ground rules. If you are a panelist, then you are welcome to raise your hand. And Rohini, depending on the flow of the presentation, will call on you to ask your question directly. You can also use the chat function, which the co-authors will be monitoring, and some questions will be answered there directly, or Rohini again might sort of bump it up to general discussion at the right moment. You'll know your panelist if you sort of see the chat and raise hand functions. We have a few other people joining us on our Zoom stream. We've decided that the first 10 minutes will be sort of a cone of silence for the presenter, just to get into the topic and results. Depending on the flow of the presentation, that's Rohini's call. The last 10 minutes will hopefully, however, be for open discussion, but it'll depend on how the presentation goes. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rohini and from there on to the presenters.
Great, thanks Rajiv, and thanks to everyone at NYU for organizing this. So we'll hand over to David now, and we'll not take questions for the first 10 minutes, and then after that, take it at some frequency, and then depending on the flow of questions, either just let David continue on till 11:30 or have a few minutes in the end for open discussion. So David, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having this paper on the program. I'm very eager to hear your comments and your feedbacks. This is a paper try to sort of describe and understand the political economy of policy experimentation in China. And this is joint work with Shaoda, who's also in the audience and helping me answer the questions. Okay. So I want to start by thinking about sort of broadly about the role of policy learning and policy experimentations. And we're often sort of thinking that it's one of the critical and essential component of government's decision making is to figure out which policies are effective and which policies the government should be rolling out to the country. Many governments has implicitly or explicitly engaged in various forms of policy learning and policy experimentation over time, and some of them involve sort of deliberate sequences of trials and errors, and some even involve sort of rigorous mirror control trials, very much due to the credit of many members in this audience. Okay. Now, the systematic policy experimentation that took place in China since the 1980s are quite unparalleled in their breadth, depth, and durations. So ever since the reform started in China, so the governments are systematically trying out different forms of policies in different regions before they decide whether that policy is something desirable to push out to the entire country. Okay, many political economists in this realm even speculate that one of the primary reasons why China's development has been so successful and the reform has been sort of quite gradual and again successful in that dimension is due to the systematic policy experimentations. Okay. What we're trying to do in this project is try to describe and understand China's policy experimentation that took place in the past 4 decades. So this is going to be a big part of this paper is going to be descriptive, and we hope that we're providing this descriptive access is going to generate some new facts and some new insights. In particular, our hope is that this is going to highlight the complexity and various political economy factors and constraints that is oftentimes inevitable when large policy experimentations took place in real life. And that's going to make policy learning and policy experimentation a quite challenging endeavor, even in a context we often think is one of the more successful cases. Okay, so let me give you a quick overview of what we do in this project. Now, part of this descriptive exercise is going to start with a data collection effort. We're going to try our best to collect as comprehensive as we can on all the policy experimentations that took place in China over the last 4 decades. And this is going to cover about 139 ministries and commissions and then the experimentation that they have initiated over the course of this period. Okay. We're going to start with a case study focused on one particular experimentation that aims to reform the regional governments, the county governments' fiscal rules or their fiscal empower. It's a reform that aims to empower the local county governments in making fiscal decisions. And this case study is going to have 2 functions. One is to just fix ideas to illustrate what a typical experimentation looks like. And also, this case study is going to help sort of generate a couple of sort of facts that's going to motivate some of the broader questions that we ask. I'm going to show you that in this particular experimentation on county fiscal empowerment reform, we observe very large heterogeneity in the reform's effect. We see sort of positive treatment effects of this particular reform on the counties who are part of the experimentation in early waves. And then we start seeing the opposite effect towards the end of the experimentation. And this large heterogeneity of the treatment effects can be largely sort of explained by the early positive selection in experimentation sites and gradually moving towards negative selection. Okay. Now we're going to zoom out to all the experimentation that we have collected in our data sets and motivated by some of the facts that I'll show you in the case study. When asked, is the site selection in the policy experimentations in China over the last 40 years actually representative? And I'm going to show you sort of pretty convincing evidence that there's widespread positive selection of the experimentation sites. Even with fairly conservative tests, we can fairly confidently reject at least 40% of the experimentations are significantly deviating from being representative in the site selection. And in fact, they're mostly positive selected in that direction. Okay. Now, that's our first sort of research question. The second one being, now what explains this deviation from representativeness, in particular positive selection? I'm going to show you a couple of sort of models that put forward in recent literature that incorporate learning-related consideration that induce sort of optimal expectation that deviates from pure randomization or pure sort of representativeness. And I'm going to show you that these considerations cannot justify the magnitudes of positive selection that we observe. Okay. In fact, I'm going to show you a few evidence that a large proportion of the positive selection that we observe can be attributed to this misaligned incentive across the political hierarchies, where the central government prefers things to be representative, where in the implementation stage, the ministers, local government are pushing the expectation to be deviating from being representative. Okay. Now, our final question is why deviation from representatives matters. I'm showing you a couple of consequences of such deviation. The positive selection selected experimentation, to the extent that they generate more positive signals, and to the extent the central government don't incorporate or account for the positive selection of the experimentation, induces those positive selected experimentations to be much more likely to roll out to the entire country and become national policies. And to the extent that there are large heterogeneity in the sort of the reform that's being tried, this positive selected experimentation on average is going to bias the implemented policies towards a domain that favors more developed regions and enlarge sort of regional inequalities. Okay, so that's the game plan for today, and we're going to jump right into to describe our data and show you the case study and the 3 questions that we asked. Okay, so our primary data sources come from a sort of, we think it's close to the universe of the database on China's government's documents. We're going to focus on the period after the reform era in China officially started in the 1980s. And based on this, the database on Chinese government documents, we're going to sort of single out about 20,000 documents issued by various layers of the Chinese government that is explicitly about policy experimentations. Okay, that give us about 4,000 documents coming from the central government. Those documents sort of are explicitly sort of describing the goals of the experimentation, the ministries that are involved, the schedule of the rollout, the sites that are being selected, whether voluntary participation are allowed, and various other aspects of the experimentation, which some of the facts you're going to see throughout the talk. Okay. We're going to combine that and match that with about 15,000 local government documents, which essentially is that for each of the local government or local county government, city government, for part of the experimentation, they're going to respond to the central government's call for experimentation by issuing their own corresponding documents to describe how they're actually going to implement experimentation, and if they're going to make some tweaks, what exactly would that look like? Okay, so that's going to be our universe, and from these documents, we're going to sort of try to the extent that some policy evolve over time, we're going to try to match them over time, and this is going to give us about just a little over 850 policy experientations that are initiated by about 139 ministries and commissions in China over the last 40 years. It should be very clear here that what we are sort of including and what sort of in so far in this particular data collection exercise that's excluded. So these experimentations are the ones that are initiated by the central government, and then they roll out to the rest of the country. Now, in that sense, what we're not going to be able to observe is, of course, the policies that never enter the experimentation stage that roll out directly to the rest of the country. There are going to be a large amount of them where we're sort of going to eventually be able to benchmark, but not yet. What we're also not going to be directly observed is that the policy experimentations that are bottom up initiated by the local government and failed or deemed as unfavorable by the central government never reached that stage. So that's not going to be a part of our analysis so far. So essentially, we're going to see the policies either initially driven by bottom-up initiation or central government's own initiation. But at the time of central government decide to formally roll it out as an experimentation, we think are fairly comprehensive at covering those. Okay. So here I'm plotting you sort of just the number of experimentation that initiated in a particular year over the last 40 years. You see a fairly sort of interesting inverse U pattern where there's increasing number of experimentation that took place in the early sort of in the 90s and early 2000s, and all the way until sort of early 2010s, and it will start to see a decline almost by about 50% from the peak of experimentations. Okay. It's not. I won't have time in the talk today to focus on what explain this decline. But in a paper we find that sort of a lot of this decline can actually be driven by this vertical reform of the organization structure within the Chinese government, where there used to be a lot of the organizations in Chinese government used to be flat and horizontal, which makes implementation quite easy because of the flexibility across local regions, and as different ministries become verticalized in the reform, the experimentation also starts to sort of decreases.
So David, I think there's a couple of related questions here, which are related to how to think about a policy versus experiment. So Claudia, would you like to ask the question directly?
Yeah, sure. No, sorry, David, to interrupt, but just to make sure, I think we all understand. What's the difference between a policy vis-a-vis a policy experimentation? And is a policy experimentation something that's in a unit, specific unit? Can you define that better?
And let me just add, sorry, David, just before that, Esther has a set of related questions to that. Kind of what is an experiment in this context? How is it defined? Is it a policy with a sunset? So
yeah. So I think part of this is going to become slightly more clear when I go through this case study that I think is pretty sort of illustrative of a typical experimentation. And take the simplest form is central government. In this particular example, central government decides to give local county government more physical power to make decisions. They take that formula and then they essentially pick a number of counties gradually and say, you guys try it, and we're going to evaluate based on whatever criteria they use. And then they gradually roll it out before at some point decide whether this is going to become a national policy. Okay, so by experimentation, what we mean is that the central government decide this is a potential policy that we would like to try, and they're going to be into this phase of trying out the different regions. And until the time, a given moment, they can decide whether this is a failure, and we're not going to roll it out and scratch it, or we're going to push out. But experimentation is the period where central government decide to try all the way until the moment where it either become a national policy or decide to sort of completely erase.
Esther, why don't you jump in here since I think you have some follow-ups.
Yeah, I was wondering whether in the document that you extract this down, it's kind of its own category. It's like they have a stamp for it saying this is a pilot, we'll evaluate it and get back. Yeah,
exactly. So there's a number of keywords that flag sort of this is experimentation. So pilot will be one way they mention. Experimentation will be, there are different words for that in Chinese, but we sort of essentially we're essentially, yeah, it's any documents that mention in the things in that flavor, we're extracting those. Yeah. Okay, so actually, this is a great leeway of one of the reasons why I want to go through a case study is to just fix your idea on what a typical experimentation looks like actually in this place. Okay, this is actually one of the more well-known experimentation and fairly large-scale one in this period. So it's an experimentation on county physical empowerment. So the status quo before the experimentation or the reform started is that the provincial government in China, which is one layer below the central government, administers prefectural government, city governments, and the city governments then administers the county government. That's the layer for bureaucracy in China. And many sort of scholars in China sort of attribute the lack of fiscal autonomy at the county level to be one of the reasons why there's a lot of sort of hindrance of county development. And in responding to this and to guide potentially sort of national policy, the central government decided to try out a policy that essentially give county government more fiscal autonomy, that essentially allow the provincial government to bypass prefectural government and directly administer county government and then allocate the fiscal resources to the county. And then that's potentially sort of avoid some distortion the prefectural government as a middle layer might be. So that's sort of a reform that the Chinese government is aiming to try. And so they try this policy gradually over the course of 2002 to 2013. That's the experimentation phase. That sort of the gradual rollout is about to about 1,000 counties that covered roughly about half of the counties in China to be experiencing this to be part of the experimentation. Okay. Now, this experimentation is explicitly tried to aim at looking at sort of or stimulating local growth. So there is an outcome that we can directly sort of just look at the impact of this experimentation. We can estimate a simple event study specification to look at what this particular experimentation or reform did to the counties who are part of this experimentation. This is a fairly standard event study specification. This is not to say this is the model that the Chinese government uses, but this is one where applied economists might use. So we're going to look at for each county on the local economic performance as a function of the year relative to the year when they joined that particular experimentation, controlling for the county fixed effects and controlling for the province year fixed effects. So it's a standard event study design where we're going to compare within county before and after they join the experimentation. Okay, I'm going to run the event study specification on two subsamples, either in the first part of in the first half of the experimentation, sort of where half the counties are joining this particular reform, and plotting you here the event study time coefficient, where you see something that you see in a lot of sort of event study design where there's not too much evidence for pre-trend, and by counting the county enjoying more fiscal empowerment, and indeed, as the central government intended, boosted the local economic performance. The GDP growth rate has gone up by about 0.1 of a log point after the second year, and so on. So it seems to be a fairly successful reform that they might want to control to the rest of the country. Okay. However, if we were to look at the second half of the experimentation, the one that joined the experiment after 2007, again, we don't see much of a pre-trend, but we start seeing the opposite treatment effects of those counties who joined the exact same sort of reform in the county fiscal empowerment start to get hurt by this very policy that the central government are trying out. Okay. In fact, if I were to do this a bit more continuously, I can define sort of a cohort of counties who join the experimentation in a particular year. And just to sort of mimic the event study, I'm going to call a cohort with, say, a cohort of counties in 2005 will be plus or minus 1 year. So that in the 3 years, we can still estimate the event study design, and having this rolling window estimates, which I'm showing you the coefficients here. So what we see here is that the early counties, the early cohorts of the county who join experimentation are really benefiting from this local fiscal empowerment, but the effects start to shrink, and it becomes even marginally negative, hurt the county's development towards the very end of the experimentation, the last 3 cohorts of the counties who joined.
So, David, I think there are a couple of related questions. As you said, you ran an event study, which is one thing an econometrician could do. But I think there are people interested in the objective function that the government actually had. So Nancy has a set of questions, so maybe she wants to ask them directly.
Oh, I was just reading Shaoda's answers to my questions. So I guess one question was about the potential selection, which Shaoda sort of addressed, which is to what extent are the policies that are officially piloted the ones that they think are going to be more controversial?
Yeah. So the selection at the extensive margin is something that we really would like to look into eventually, but at the current stage, we just don't, because we don't, there are two sets that we don't observe. We eventually can observe the policies that never went through experimentation but become national policy. We can essentially benchmark the experimented policies to that set. Now there's another set, there are the policies that local governments initiated or wanted, but central government never wanted and never ever got to this stage of experimentation. So that one, we've been trying to get a handle of some of those policies, but that has been very hard. So to the extent that, I think the simple answer, unsatisfying answer is that the set of policies that get to the stage of being experimented in a fairly formal sort of manner is a set of policies that central government already has maybe on net positive prior over that they're going to work. And they just want to make sure they work before they officially make it a national policy.
And then just very quickly related to that, why do you presume that the central government would prefer to have a representative sample? Like I would have thought that they wanted a selected sample of places that gave them a sense of how things work, but also wouldn't protest politically if things didn't work.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we're not going to make a presumption on that, and part of so when I get to the second part of the questions, what explains this possible selection that we see broadly, I'm going to show you a bunch of things that what exactly this. It's always hard to know exactly what the central government wants, but then we're trying our best to get a sense of what's aligned with their incentive, what's aligned with local government's incentive, and so on. So I will prefer to hold on to this question for a couple of slides before we open that up. Okay, so let me go back to this particular case, the physical empowerment reform. I just show you this decreasing treatment effects of this particular the same policy over time. And what I'm showing you in this figure is that for each cohort of the experimentation sites, we can compare the pre-experimentation local characteristics such as local GDP and so on among the counties that get selected to be a part of the experimentation or not. And then I'm plotting you here the t-stats of those comparisons. We can compare the t-stats of 0, meaning so they're essentially identical. And then there's a confidence band that we're plotting here in red. Okay? So you see a pattern of the experimentation are very massively positively selected in the pre-experimentation characteristics. They're much richer. The t-stats is on the magnitude 10. So they're essentially the richest place in China relative to the other ones. And they gradually become less positive selected, but still on average positive selected over time. Okay, so that those seems to be lining up. If we were to make a very simple sort of extrapolation about this, how the genius treatment effects on this particular policy is linear with respect to local economic conditions, and we can simulate how would this particular policy affect local economic performance, sort of depending on the pre-expectation conditions. We actually can sort of, when I'm plotting here the distribution of the policy effect had it been rolled out to the entire country, you can actually see that the whole policy will have on net a 0 effect to the entire country, but with very large distributional consequences, where about half the countries in China will really benefit from this policy, and they're the richer places by nature of this heterogeneity that we're estimating, and then half the countries are going to be hurt by this very policy. Okay. So the bottom line from this case, and I'm going to zoom out to this experimentation, look at all the conditions in more detail, is that we see fairly large heterogeneity in a lot of these policies, treatment effects among experimentation sites. And to the extent that these experimentation sites are positively selected, or in this particular case, the external validity of those experimentations are somewhat limited. You see sort of weakly positive average treatment effects among the experimentation sites. But the net effects can be very close to 0 and even slightly negative had the policy been rolled to the entire country. And I should emphasize that this will suggest some degree of site selection bias, and this is not even considering sort of internal validity issue to the extent that if there's additional biases, central government might evaluate in the policy, not using, for example, the event site design, there might be further biases apart from the issue related to external validity. Okay. We show in this particular, actually, I won't have time to show you in details, but in this particular case, we already have some hints that there seems to be some political forces that's pushing for positive selection, that the provincial government who had more counties who would have benefited more from this policy are really eager in pushing for them to join this experimentation. And they're very proud of being part of the experimentation and publicize them being part of the experimentation. And we're going to show you later that this local government eager to joining, potentially driven by their career concerns, is one of the reasons why we see this particular deviation. But sort of, I hope that this is giving you a sense of what the experimentation looks like. And then we're going to start to zoom out from this particular case and see whether this pattern holds more generally for all the policy implementations on average that we see in China in the last 40 years.
So David, I think there are a set of questions on kind of thinking about how you want to interpret this notion of experimentation. So I think I'll ask from a while ago, Stefano Caria, who had a version of this question, if he wants to directly ask it.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Fantastic. Fantastic. I was just wondering, so if the objective of the government is both exploration and exploitation, that is, they care about the GDP, the welfare that's generated by the policies, then it would actually seem quite natural that if you have a heterogeneity in treatment effects, you start by targeting, and you have some informative prior. You use the prior, and adaptively you start by the sites where you're going to exploit the most and then go down. So I was a little bit puzzled by the initial statement where you said, this cannot be squared with an optimal adaptive experimentation procedure.
Yeah, no, so you're exactly right. And then this, give me 2 more slides. I'm going to get into some of the, this is actually a sort of a booming recent literature about sort of incorporating some of these additional concerns in addition to learning. And then that's many of the models will have a prediction that deviates from pure randomization. And then we're going to essentially do a simulation exercise to see that if you incorporate those motivation and then even push those motivation to the extreme, is that enough to generate the degree of positive selection that we see? And then essentially the bottom line is that it will generate positive selection exactly as the intuition. And it's a couple of models in that class will have those predictions, but they will generate mild positive selection, not to the scale of T stats of 10. Or sort of, I can tell you sort of, what the central government's objective function would be under some of the models had this been optimal design of experimentation. Let me, so actually,
just one more question, just so that people are thinking, which I think a couple of people have, but the most recent one I can see is from Nick Ryan, asking about the sort of scaling issue. So Nick, do you want to?
Sure. So I was curious, you've been treating the treatment effect, if you will, as sort of an exogenous and fixed characteristic of the county that is invariant to the time at which that county is being treated. An alternate view is that there's some kind of first mover advantage because, for example, counties are offering investment incentives, setting up kind of the local equivalent of a special economic zone, cutting taxes to attract businesses and so forth. And so they're able to increase GDP very rapidly because there's mobile capital or other factors across counties. But once some place is already doing that, then I can't do that as a second mover. And in that view, it's sort of more an equilibrium spillover rather than that there's a fixed characteristic and it's really selection across counties over time that is changing. So one way to tell these apart would be to tell us what is it that counties are doing in order to grow so quickly?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So I won't give you a perfectly satisfying answer. Part is because we so far hasn't been able to do this for all the policies, but for this particular policy, the fiscal empowerment policy, we don't think, and this is not a statement and probably universally true, but at least for this particular policy, we don't see a very strong evidence of this G effects of first mover advantage that you described, because for a few counties that get into the experimentation that are actually poor in the first wave of experimentation, there are also sort of lost from the experimentation. Their growth rate also decreases, and that estimate is actually fairly similar to the poor countries who enter experimentation towards the latter part. So that we don't think is purely sort of a timing thing of early versus latter, and which, as you suggest, we can definitely look more into part of the rich information we have from local documentation is to see what did actually they do and do they deviate a little bit and sort of they innovate when they're being joined in the experimentation, and that's something we're working on at the moment, and see how the policy actual implementation of policy evolve over time. But at least for this one, we don't think GE effect is a first order thing per se to explain the treatment effects. So let me move on unless I guess if there are more questions. But let me move on to go to our first question. Zooming out to all the experimentations that China has did in the last 40 years, again, central government initiated experimentations, is the selection of the experimentation sites representative? Okay, so the way I'm gonna show you, and it actually in the end, sort of the outcome doesn't quite, the result doesn't quite matter depending on how we're gonna do the test. But I'm gonna show you one fairly simple and straightforward way. So for each experimentation, we're going to compare the pre-experimentation characteristics. We're going to take local GDP per capita, but we can take any other regional characteristics, and it's not going to matter that much. Between the sites that are part of the experimentation, I'm going to call those treatment sites, and the experimentations and the counties or local regions that are not part of the experimentation. Those are control sites. Okay. I'm going to use the t-stats of this comparison as a summary stats of how much deviation there is towards representativeness. The t-stats of 0, meaning that they're sort of exactly not exactly representative. Okay, so we're going to adjust for the sample size because not all the experimentation have sort of equal splits between treatment and control. So the t-stats is going to adjust for that, and I'm going to show you also a adjusted sort of the confidence interval depending on the sort of the number of sites that are being part of the experimentation for each of the policy experimentation that we see. Okay, so here I'm showing you the distribution of the t-stats pulled together of the 840 policy experimentation. On the left panel, and on the right panel is a CDF of the t-stats. So the punchline is that you see much of the masses of the t-stats is to the right of 0. And if we take a very conservative confidence band of rejecting rejecting the t-stats only above sort of the 90% confidence interval due to chance, even with that very conservative test, we can at least say that 40% experimentation has deviation from representativeness, and oftentimes in the positive selection direction that are sufficiently different from 0 that we can reject that. Okay, it doesn't quite matter which characteristics we used to test, and what's exactly was the procedure for the test. Okay, a number of issues, which some of them related to Nick's question earlier also, is that this t-stats significantly being positive, meaning being positive selected, is not quite time changing across the last 4 decades of the experimentation. We see a positive t-stats sort of over fairly stable over time. There is, however, pretty substantial variation of that across ministries in terms of the policy domain. But in particular, and somewhat interestingly, in the domain where you think that it has to be a national uniform policy, there's really isn't any scope of targeting that if the policy becomes successful, it will have to be a national policy, like tax policy or certain fiscal policy. You actually see a bigger degree of positive selection. Where for the domains such as agricultural policies, where you actually might have more scope of local targeted policies, where it doesn't need to be rolled out to the rest of the country, we don't see as much of positive selection, but still on average, there is some positive selection there. Okay.
So David, I think Karthik has some questions on how to interpret these sort of distributional effects. So Karthik, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so I think 2 quick questions, right? I mean, so one is when you say that the net effect is 0, is that true in a population weighted way? I mean, that's an easy question. But the other one more generally is when you decentralize, you should expect an increase in inequality as a function of pre-existing capacity to, do the most with this authority that you've been given, right? So in that sense, why is this surprising? I mean, I'm not saying it's not important with regard to kind of if the basic story here is that there's positive selection and site selection, and so we may be kind of mistakenly extrapolating that effectiveness to the country. So I think that's super exciting, but the underlying result seems what you would expect in any decentralization, right? I mean, so just wanted to see if there's something I'm missing over and above that.
Yeah. So the first one, it's not weighted by country population, so that but we can check. That's always easy check to see whether that net effect holds if we do various weighting. The second one, the ultimate question, which is very much the focus of the third question, like why do we care, and what's the consequence of this deviation from representativeness? I think at the bottom, it's going to depend on to what extent the central government, when they evaluate national policy, they take this positive selection into account. are they sort of, taking naively any positive signal from, in an extreme case, if you try anything in Shanghai, it will probably work very well. And that's not going to tell you that much about whether this policy should be a national policy for China. Now, to the extent that they are learning about national policy and they're learning in a very rich places, and sort of to what extent are sophisticated of devising that, that's gonna matter a lot. And then the second question is that, in fact, I will very much say that this is environment of a top-down experimentation that's very different from a bottom-up experimentation that you see in the federalist sort of environment, where it is going to have some different predictions of, in the bottom-up experimentation, you actually oftentimes see on the experimentation because people free ride on others' information, apart from the first mover advantage, for example. But in the top-down experimentation, you might have different incentives, different distortions in the learning environment, which again, I hope to open some of this up towards the end of the talk.
Yeah, and that, I guess, just a 30-second or 2-second follow-up from the earlier one, right? Which is, how much should we think of this as the top-down saying this is where this will happen, as opposed to the kind of the central government saying here's the reform that we would like to see, but then in the end there is some hybrid of bottom-up and top-down where you lay out a possible reform and people say that we would like to do this, right?
Yeah. No, I think in reality, I think it's in that regard, I think it's a mixture in the sense of, you can take if the central government puts into a document and mandate, and again, this is back to one of the questions earlier, that signal very strongly that this is something central government really wants to see and wants to do. And local governments, have various incentives to make it work. And then part of the innovation in policy space is to, central government is essentially allocate some of this innovation role to the local government. So now there still is a question of if all the tinkering and tailoring of the policy details is happening in the rich places, it may not be suitable for the poor place, and to the extent the central government don't then make the adaptation or particular tailored policies in those inclusion stage to the poor place, that can still generate distributional consequences. Which hopefully I will have some time to show you some of those patterns.
David, we'll give you some time to continue, but I think there's actually one useful question from Pascaline to understand on just the overall sample selection that probably useful for everyone. So Pascaline, if you want to go ahead, and then we'll give David a bit of time.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether we should be worried about the representativeness of your data with respect to the actual experimentation that happened. And could it be that you only have records of things that works kind of okay at the beginning because the government is trying to, protect whatever transpires of the success of the experimentation?
Yeah. So we definitely see a lot of experimentation that only stay at the experimentation stage and didn't roll out. Now the question is is there like major disasters that they erased from all the documentation out there? That I'm worried slightly less about because in the sense of you have to erase all the central government documents and every single local government documents talking about the same policy for us to not be able to see any trace of it. And we just actually don't see, and we see the fail rate is not low. It's like a third of the policy never end up becoming a national policy. And the typical way is like central government admits this is failure. They just never continue the policy implementation and then roll back the experimentation implicitly. And that's a third of the policy implementation end up that way. So I don't think that level of selection is particularly severe, but we definitely can do a bit more to try to see some of the robustness on that domain. Okay. As part of that, once you have a document, it was a strong state bureaucracy. Once you have documents out there, it's a little bit hard for you to erase that completely from the internet. Okay, so let me take the possible selection I just show you. Our next question is to try to see what explains this possible selection. Again, I sort of alluded to this earlier with my discussion with a few questions. I want to start by thinking about a couple of recent models of optimal experimentation with various learning related considerations, and see can we sort of essentially justify the possible selection using those models and pushing those models to the extreme to some extent. And then I'm going to show you, what about sort of various other political environment related issues, such as misaligned incentives across political hierarchy. Can those explain the deviation from representativeness? Okay, so let me start with the optimal design of experimentation. This is not going to be an exhaustive list. I'm going to show you a few examples, and then a lot of the additional sort of motivation can be nested in these high level models. So there's some recent models that sort of essentially predict that if besides the standard learning, if the decision maker, in this case central government, cares about its subjective expected utility, and if the central government happens to have very asymmetric priors and it weights very heavily towards its own subjective expected utility rather than just persuading others or learning, persuading others and against sort of the hostile who has hostile utility, you could have the optimal experimentation in this particular environment to be deterministic, and that's going to deviate from randomization. And if the prior is symmetric towards positive, then it could generate positive selection. Okay, so we can do a bunch of simulations using those models, and what sort of the bottom line we find from those simulations is that even if you put 100% of the weights on maximizing subjective utility, and using the various parameters that we can estimate from our own environment about the experimentation, treatment effects, and heterogeneity, and so on, this maximizing subjective utility style justification can generate a optimal t-stats of experimentation on the magnitude of 0.75 or 1 if you push it even further. And that's going to be sort of not enough to explain sort of the much bigger average t-stats that we see in many of the experimentation that we observe. Okay, so that's not to say sort of maximizing subjective utility from a decision maker perspective doesn't matter. It's just that that itself seems to be not enough to explain the degree of positive selection. In a similar spirit, some recent literature also suggests that if the decision maker cares about the welfare of the experimentation sites, especially given finite sample, each of the places you try the experimentation, it's not just for learning, but it's the region's livelihood and so on. Central government might care about. And to the extent there are heterogeneous treatment effects, and if there are heterogeneous welfare weights the central government places across the regions, it could justify deviation from randomization. Okay. Now our simulation, again, taking those models and taking sort of some of the parameters we can estimate from the heterogeneous treatment effects that we see, you will have to put all the welfare weights on those initially selected experimentation sites, essentially to justify pretty much the positive selection we observe. And this is not to say that this is impossible. It's just to say that this will be the central government. This will have to be roughly the central government's objective function if you want to justify the positive selection under these style models. You can also sort of think about related models about what if richer places provide more precise signals, and in particular for the very complicated experimentation, you have to try it in the rich places to actually sort of make the experimentation itself work, to give it meaningful signals. We can net that into some of the previous model, but some of the smoking gun evidence suggests this cannot be the full story, is that those complex experimentation that involve multiple ministries, involve multiple departments and so on, they're actually not more positively selected than the slightly more simpler experimentations. So it doesn't seem to be central government allocating those very complex ones to Shanghai because they think that that's the only place this trial can work. Okay. Now, I think this is related also finally to some of the discussion with Katya. This is all under, again, the implicit assumption, which I think shouldn't take for granted, that these designs are optimal if the central governments are sophisticated enough to debiasing essentially their possible selection, and then they get back to the policy that's desirable. But to the extent that if the central government don't take into account of the possible selection, even under the optimal design, it still can generate sort of suboptimal policy outcomes. Okay. Now the question that sort of Nancy sort of alluded to earlier is that, now what if, is there any hints that central government ever even wanted to representative policies, the experimentation sites to begin with? There's a lot of sort of mandates in the central government sort of documents that, especially for example, from the National Development Reform Commissions that overseeing the policy implementation over years, that explicitly said a balanced sample, using our language, a balanced sample or representative sample is something that's desirable. That this is something that they're striving for. That's not to say they don't have alternative sort of counteracting objectives, which I'll show you some evidence, but at least sort of they understand representative sample is something that's useful and important to have, and this is what they're driving for. And some of the sort of smoking gun evidence that they're part of the deviation from representativeness happen not at the central government designing level, but at the implementation level, is that for those experimentation that are closer to there's the site selection that are closer to direct control by the central government, we see less of positive selection. for example, if the experimentation only allow for top-down assignments and doesn't allow for any volunteer joining, we see much less positive selection. And for some of the experimentation that the central government select provinces, which are much more directly under the central government's control, and then the selected provinces then select their own counties to be part of the experimentation. For those two layers of the experimentation design, we see that the provincial level representativeness is much higher. And then you start to deviate from representativeness and start get positive selection once you get into the county level selection, where the county, the provincial government are in charge of that level of selection. Okay. I want to show you.
David, sorry, just before you kind of get into your explanation, I don't know if Ben wants to come in here, who is trying to think of some other alternatives.
Well, yeah, so it was related to this optimal experimental question. So Shaoda and I had a bit of a back and forth on this. So the question I'm trying to think through is, you could imagine some types of policies, you might want to implement them nationally, but the impact of them is only going to depend on, be relevant in certain kinds of areas. So for example, think about a tax policy. It only, the overall impact of this policy is going to be driven by places with high tax base, for example. You may roll it out nationally, but the small places don't really matter much. In that kind of world, your optimal experimentation should be based on places where you were prior this thing is going to have a stronger treatment effect. So I'm wondering if that could be possibly an explanation for what's going on.
Yeah, so it could very well be. So we haven't done this for all the policy domains. For some of the easier ones, we can do, for example, agriculture policy. And it's much easier for us to look at the base, and then we see the positive selection is still there, and even more strongly there in some sense when we look at just agricultural basis, and removing all the just urban center doesn't have much production, and that wouldn't be affected by any agriculture policy law per se. But we can do this more generally for all the domains that we can. So yeah. Now, ultimately, I think part of the question also alluded to is that I'm taking the implicit assumption that a lot of the policy in the end is going to end up being a national policy, that there isn't much of a targeting per se, that you can't stop at one third of the place get treated and just forget it for the rest of the 2/3. And that would entail a very different sort of designing mechanism, where I think much of the policy, at least in our sample that we see, is that they will have to be eventually either become a national policy, or the central government decide, okay, this is not going to work, and then they're going to go back. There is going to be some middle domain where the policies just stay at a certain size, and we can look into more closely into what the sort of the experimentation look like for them. And then they're more like sort of a targeting exercise than the experimentation per se. Okay. So I want to spend a bit more time on going through actually two particular political incentives that we think are I think sort of pretty important in driving some of the deviation that we see. And this is again not meant to be exhaustive, but two particular ones that we can sort of fairly well identify using the prior literature. The first one is political patronage. So the idea is that are the ministers, for example, agriculture ministers, more likely to sign experimentation to the local governments that they're connected to, that he or she is connected to. Okay, so we're going to use, so we're going to measure connectedness using the fairly standard measure from the literature, starting from Rick Fissman's work and so on. It's essentially if a leader in a particular region, in this particular province, who's going to be connected to a minister, if that particular minister has previously worked in that region. Okay, our outcome is going to be looking at whether that province is going to be part of the experimentation. And in very important, we're going to control for province by ministry fixed effects, which means that all our identifying variations is going to come from changes in local government's connection to a particular ministry because of the minister's turnover. That province wasn't connected in year 1 because of the minister hasn't worked there before. And year 2, when a new person become agriculture minister and has worked in that particular region before, that province become connected. And we're going to see whether that turnover starts to make that region become more likely to be a part of the experimentation. Okay, and this is pretty much what we see, that having a region who is connected to a particular minister is making that particular region sort of substantially more likely to be part of the experimentation, and to the extent that sort of the ministers are more likely coming from relatively rich places in China, that's going to start drive the assignment of the experimentation sites towards positive selection. Okay, that's source number 1. Another particular source of political incentive and misalignment of incentive between central and local government is that local government might have very different career incentives, and then the central government want to learn about the policy for the whole country. So we can look at whether politicians, local politicians who have greater promotion incentives are more likely to or more eager to find their way to join the experimentation. So we can look at sort of the likelihood of them joining or being part of the experimentation as a function of their political incentive. We're going to use the one that's fairly centered in literature, where the political incentive is going to vary depending on that local politician's age relative to the retirement. So if after my current term I'm going to be mandatorily retired at age 60, then there's no hope for me to be promoted, and my political incentive is going to be lower than someone who has additional at least one more term to go before he has to be forced to retire. Okay, so we're going to include prefecture and year fixed effects in the specification, which means that all of our identifying variations can come from within prefecture across year changes in the career incentive due to this discontinuous aging relative to the retirement age. Okay. Now we see something again, sort of pointing in the direction of, for the local government, who still have a bit more way to go and to potentially do well in the policy performance and get promoted. Those local governments and in the region that they're representing are more likely to get themselves into experimentation. And sort of to the extent that on average, the richer places has sort of more of those local governments on the pipeline of getting promoted, that's going to start to shift the experimentation towards policy selection. So overall, if we do a bit of a counting exercise, just incorporating this political patronage, that would be the misalignment between the central government and the ministers when they're assigning, or the misalignment due to the local politicians' career incentives. Those two factors can account for already about half of the policy selection that we observe on average. Okay.
So David, just to jump in here, I think Rajesh has a question that others are interested in also. Rajesh, would you like to?
So you're on mute, I guess.
Yeah, thanks. No, I was just wondering that, you interpret the fact that, the knowledge that somebody in a particular province as being handing of political patronage. And I was just wondering, is there any way to kind of rule out the fact that, this could be just better information flows about capability? Similarly, thinking about, your career incentives, you could think about that's just being correlated heavily with age, and you're thinking about younger people being more enthusiastic about being willing to try out new policy, and whether we could distinguish between these two channels before we say that points directly to political patronage. Thanks.
So for the patronage one, for example, one thing that we can show you is, if you're connected to the minister and you happen to be in a very poor place, that actually doesn't quite help you get into the experimentation sites nearly as much as if you happen to be the Shanghai local government and you're connected to the finance minister. You're much more likely to get those conditions than a nearby city. So it seems to be, so in some sense, it's patronage interacted with being a rich place that really start to push up the chance of you getting into experimentation rather than patronage and a poor place. And if you think about, I think your intuition is that patronage generates more information from the trials than you find there are per se. All right. So one final thing, actually, I want to show you on the misalignment part, and this is what Nancy sort of brought up earlier, is that so far everything I'm suggesting is that central government wants representativeness, and then there's something deviating when they're implementing the trial that they're meant to be representative. Now, there are obviously also going to be many potential incentives for this objective central government have that itself is deviating from being representative. One prominent one is that the central government might want to minimize political risk, and they don't want policy change to generate any further political risk. So you can think about a veto condition for you to product experimentation is that if you have experienced protests previously. And we indeed see that regions that have previous protest occurrence in the previous year, for example, don't get themselves into any future experimentation, at least for a few years. And to the extent that that's going to deviate, to the extent that protests are correlated with a lot of political, sort of local economic conditions, that's going to deviate in further from the representatives. But that itself could be a part of the central government's objective, but that objective is conflicting from acquiring a representative sample. Okay, so I guess I have 5 more minutes. I want to spend the last bits to talk about sort of why this matters, what's the consequence of this deviation, and what I'm sort of suggesting implicitly a lot throughout is that to the extent that this positive site selection generates more likely to generate positive signals for certain policies, and to the extent that central government don't fully take that into account, you're going to potentially have an issue of the national policy that you end up getting rolled out. Now, the first thing I want to show you is that do these positive selective experimentations actually end up being more likely to be successful? And successful meaning more likely to get rolled out to the rest of the country. And that's indeed what we see is that what I'm showing you here is essentially sort of the t-stats of the experimentation, how non-representative it is, predicting sort of the likelihood of the policy getting rolled out eventually. And we see sort of a very strong positive relationship there. Is in sense the policies that are much more positive selected have a much higher chance of getting into a national policy. And in fact, sort of what's interesting here is that if we single out those positive selective policy experimentation that are very likely, or a lot of the policy selection is coming from the political incentive misalignment that I show you about patronage and local governments, those positive selective policies also gets rolled out more likely, and so the central government don't account for this potential sort of unwanted positive selection potentially when they do this evaluation. A related question is that do central government are sophisticated enough to sort of exclude various orthogonal signals when they evaluate the policies? To the extent to which they don't roll out political patronage when they think about policy selection suggests that they're not that sophisticated. We can ask the question in a slightly different way. Look at, so for example, within agriculture policy, the way that the particular experimentation work or not shouldn't be a particular function of the natural disaster that region experienced. Those should just be orthogonal to the policy itself. And so we can sort of do the exercise of, for the mixture of experimentation sites that some of them experience natural disaster, does that lead that particular experimentation more likely to end up being a national policy, or sort of central government attributing the negative signal from that experimentation itself to the policy, but not to the natural disaster? And what we find is that if a policy, like agricultural policy, that rolled out to sort of experimented in places where it has a higher share of them experiencing natural disaster during the period of experimentation, those policies are less likely to roll out to the whole country. So at least to some extent, central government are not fully accounting for various orthogonal signals that are independent from the policy itself. But they're looking potentially doing some more naive evaluation of the performance of the sites that are doing experimentation. Okay. The final two results I want to show you is that now what about the among the policies that actually eventually get rolled out to the entire country? Do they have a different sort of consequences if they were heavily popularly selected when they're in the trial period? So the first thing I can show you is that for each of the policy that get rolled out to the entire country, we can calculate those sites, those local government, those local localities who are not part of the initial experimentation, their differences to the experimentation sites. And we can see, do they differentially benefiting from those policy, benefiting meaning from like growing higher growth and so on, relative to the regions who are further away in terms of the pre-experimentation conditions. Okay, so in this regression I'm showing here is that further away from the experimentation sites in terms of the pre-experimentation characteristics such as GDP growth and industrial composition and so on, when those policies become national policies, the regions sort of are faring worse, relatively speaking, in terms of their local economic performance than the places that almost look identical to experimentation sites. And when those the policy that are experimented in those places become national policy, those similar regions are benefiting, potentially because of those policy signal that motivate the central government to roll out those policies. Okay. We can do this final access in a slightly different way. That is, we can look at all the policies that roll out in China in a particular year and trace out at the time when the policy was being experimented, how severely positive selected that policy is. And we can see whether that positive selection of a policy that eventually got rolled out is associated with the subsequent inter-county Gini coefficient that captures the regional differences. And we in the column 1 and 2 here, what you see here is that the more policies that are positive selected that end up getting rolled out, you see, again, we're not going to claim causal here, but you're going to see sort of that's associated with the increase in inter-county inequality in the subsequent period. This is not just a mere fact of policies coming out of experimentation, because the policies coming from experimentation that are actually closely representative don't have this association with inter-county inequality in the subsequent period, but only among the very policy selected ones. The more you get those policies to be rolled out, the more inter-county inequality that we observe. So I'm out of time. Let me wrap up. Hopefully I show you some interesting new facts, I guess, on one of the largest scale policy experimentation systematic ones that we see in the recent history in China. And I show you some facts that experimentation sites are substantially policy selected. Part of that could be driven by misalignment between incentives across political hierarchy. And to the extent the central government doesn't seem to be fully account for such policy selection, this seems to have some distribution consequences where the national policies are systematically favoring richer places that are initially tried. Okay. I want to end by linking this to two broad literature. The first one is that to the extent that you need a strong bureaucracy and centralization to facilitate such implementation as we will see in China, this actually differs from this bottom-up federalism style experimentation that literature has studied on, where you typically have under-experimentation, people free ride on experimentation. Here, the centralization plus the political competition and local incentives can generate, on average, maybe more over-experimentation than the bottom-up version. The second one is that we see this sort of, in some sense, inevitably, the experimentation at this scale has to carry out in a very large, complex political environment where there's a lot of misaligned potential incentives. This can be linked to literature broadly about sort of the policy capture, but this is a capture at the learning stage. In some sense, the richer regions are systematically more likely to get themselves to determine the signal the central government gets when they decide on the policies. And then those are policies that end up become national policies that systematically favor richer places, or maybe more politically connected places.
Thanks, David. I think we need to wrap up here.
Yeah. So. And then that can generate issues. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, David. I'll hand over to Martin now, the next session.
Great. Thanks so much for a really interesting talk. So next up, we have Urban Public Works and Spatial Equilibrium, Experimental Evidence from Ethiopia.
Great, thanks so much for having us and including the paper in the conference. We're really excited to present it today. This paper is about urban public works in spatial equilibrium. Just quickly to introduce my co-authors, Clement Imbert is here with us today, and he's going to be all on top of the chat, so any clarifying questions, he's going to be right on them. Girum Abebe, who was at the Ethiopian Development Research Institute when this program started 5 years ago, but is now at the World Bank, and Carolina Mejia-Mantilla, who is an economist at the World Bank. So the motivation for this paper is the study of anti-poverty programs. I hope we would all agree that a full evaluation of any anti-poverty or social protection program should take into account indirect effects of these programs, as well as the direct effects on beneficiaries, not least because there's a mounting body of evidence now accumulating of these indirect effects. So, for example, effects on the consumption of non-beneficiaries, prices, or private sector wages. It also seems that these indirect effects can be large relative to the direct effects to the direct beneficiaries of the programs, and so important to document. Today, we're going to be talking about public works, and they could have at least two important indirect effects. Firstly, they might provide important local public goods or amenities that have been notoriously difficult to document in the literature. And they may also, well, this is well documented, affect private sector wages, but it's always very challenging to quantify what those effects are. Quantifying these equilibrium effects, I think, is challenging for any program of this kind. We need randomized, well, hopefully randomized and partial rollout of the program so that we have some kind of counterfactual, but of course we need to do it at scale so that we can detect these equilibrium effects. Now, luckily for us in development economics, this kind of experimentation at scale, geographic randomization at scale is becoming increasingly common. We've seen some amazing progress as a result of that. We want to make the point today that may not always be enough, where spillover effects across potential units of randomization are a big problem. Okay, so the reduced form solution to this problem is often to kind of draw circles around treated units. So implicitly assume a parameter, a fixed radius over which spillovers extend, or kind of create a donut and cut that out and throw away that area. And I think that approach is perfectly reasonable in a rural setting where we're looking at villages that are potentially hundreds of miles away from one another. But we think it's inappropriate when we're moving to an urban context. So cities are very dense, highly interconnected. And so it's likely that almost all areas of a city are going to be affected by a program if that program is rolled out at scale. So everywhere is going to be treated to some extent. And I'm thinking in particular here about commuting flows in the labor market that mean that residents of one location can benefit from a program that is rolled out in another location within the city. These commuting flows are going to be hard to parameterize. They're not necessarily strictly based on either Euclidean distance or even travel times. And so we're going to want to do something a little bit more sophisticated there. If we don't, we're not only going to miss the spillover effects to these untreated areas, but we're also going to yield downward biased estimates by looking at reduced form effects on only the treated areas. A second problem with this literature on equilibrium effects is, of course, how to go from the evaluation with the partial rollout, which is a necessary thing to have, to the full-scale equilibrium rollout of the program. And so we think for both of these related challenges, we're going to need a model to kind of deal with these problems. And so that's the direction that this paper is going today. We're going to introduce the kind of spatial equilibrium models used in urban economics into the context of an urban public works program, randomized and scaled up in a city, and in so doing, kind of marry these two very powerful approaches. The end goal here is what we hope is a comprehensive evaluation of Ethiopia's urban public safety net program, a public works program rolled out in Addis Ababa. We're going to exploit the randomized rollout in the first year of the program, in which 40% of eligible neighborhoods areas are enrolled in the program. We're going to collect very rich survey data, primary survey data in a panel. We're going to observe both what we're calling eligible, treated households and ineligible households. We have commuting flow data, rents, and neighborhood quality. We're going to start by providing reduced form evidence of the effects of the program. We're going to show that it indeed has a large effect on the labor supply to the private sector of direct beneficiaries of the program, and therefore constitutes this labor supply shock. We're also going to document sizable positive effects on local amenities in the places where the program is rolled out. We then turn to developing the spatial equilibrium model, which we think is going to give us three main things. Firstly, it's going to give us a structure through which to identify these spatial spillovers of the program by using the commuting network. And here we leverage this rich bilateral commuting flow data between locations in the city. It's also going to help us then to kind of go to welfare and kind of put together all of these different components. So the direct effects for beneficiaries that we're going to estimate, these local amenity effects, and then the equilibrium wages that we recover from the model. And finally, it allows us to quantify these effects when fully rolled out, so to conduct a kind of counterfactual exercise to think about what these effects would be at full scale. I say counterfactual, but of course, this actually did happen. The program was rolled out at scale the year after our evaluation ended. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about what we do and talk about the contributions at the same time. We're of course not the first to document equilibrium effects of social programs, not least the paper by Karthik and others, which is kind of all over this slide. What we think is a little bit different is to take a more strictly kind of spatial structural approach, which we think is necessitated by the fact that we're now working in an urban context and are one of the first papers to do so. I think in doing so, we're also hopefully developing a bit of a toolkit as social protection in developing countries kind of moves from being a mostly rural thing to kind of increasingly more sophisticated social protection in urban areas. We've got a toolkit for evaluating those kinds of programs. Our approach is then perhaps a little closer to the approach of studying spatial equilibrium in cities, which has now been brought to developing countries as well. These models are usually used to study changes in equilibria due to shocks to the commuting or transport network. We're going to repurpose these models, instead keeping the transport network fixed and kind of looking at the propagation of labor supply shocks through the network using the same tools that they bring. This literature rarely has RCTs for identification, and so we're kind of making a step forward there. But we also have this individual data. So we're jointly observing wages and commuting decisions at the individual level, which hopefully will convince you in a minute is quite useful for things that we want to do, rather than having, for example, repeated cross sections with commuting data and labor force data in a different survey. And then more obviously, I suppose, we're adding to this now very large literature on the evaluation of public works. Too many papers here to mention. Again, we're now doing this with an explicitly urban context and making a step forward by kind of combining not just the direct effects and the labor market effects, but also getting at this elusive effect on local amenities due to the work that was done. Okay, so the outline, the reduced form, well, the description of the evaluation in the reduced form hopefully will go quite quickly, because most of what we're going to want to do is going to come through the model and the quantitative analysis. And if there's time, I'm going to get to some heterogeneity at the end. Let's see how that goes. But some of you may be frustrated initially at how kind of aggregate everything is going to be initially. We're not looking under the bonnet here at different types of households, different sectors, different types of work. What we want to do is to get through everything and then come back and rerun things from the top down, looking at different types of work. And in particular, we're going to look at self-employment versus wage employment separately and look at those two sectors. Okay, so the evaluation design, it's the Urban Productive Safety Net program that we're studying. This is a program of the government of Ethiopia, which was implemented with the support of the World Bank and launched in 2018. And it's preceded, of course, by the famous PSMP, which was more of a rural program. It's a very ambitious program. We're targeting 18% of the urban population across 11 regional cities, although our evaluation today is just going to be focused on the capital, Addis Ababa. The targeting itself is community-based, and it's done at the household level. So that part is not randomized, just to be very clear about that. One thing that is important is that there's a strict residential eligibility criteria that is enforced. So you have to have lived in a neighborhood for at least 6 months to be eligible for the program. And so we don't think that the direct benefits, at least, can spill over. So you can't access the program if you live in a neighboring area. The randomization took place within Addis Ababa across neighborhoods, which in this context are called waradas. So get used to that. I'm going to refer to them as waradas throughout. One quite nice point here is that the saturation of the program, that is the proportion of poor households that are treated, is roughly constant across areas. So the number of beneficiaries was calibrated towards data on the poor the total population of poor households using the census data. And that's going to be a nice thing to simplify some of what we do. The program is very generous, offering up to 240 days of work per household per year with very high wages. So offering quite a large premium on the daily private wage. Firstly at the daily level, but the premium is even larger at the hourly level because the number of hours work required by the program is lower than in the private sector. And so perhaps for that reason, the take-up of the program is almost complete. So conditional on being targeted by the community, I think it's like 98% of households take up almost their entire quotient to the 240 days per year. So quite a lot of work. The work that is done is done locally, so it happens in the neighborhoods in which people live, so they don't have to travel for this work, and is aimed at improving local amenities rather than, say, productive infrastructure. So we're thinking about cleaning of streets, greening, garbage disposal, and other amenities like that are often not very well provided by the central state in the city. A quick overview of what we do to evaluate this program. We conducted a baseline survey before this program started of 6,000 households across the city, which is precisely geo-referenced. The survey is meant to be representative of poor households in the city, so below the 30th percentile of consumption in the city. It includes households that are in the program, what we're going to call, well, the eligible households, and households that are not in the program, of course. And we observe earnings, employment and commuting, so location of residence and place of work. The rollout then happens in 35 out of 90 eligible wards. Balance looks pretty good. We worked together with the government of Ethiopia to do this randomization in the first year. And then we come back for our end line. We're very proud of how much work we did to get attrition down here to less than 3%, and that's unaffected by treatment. One important point is that we collected data on amenities to try and measure these changes in amenities, focusing specifically on the 5 main activities that are done under the public works. And so we're asking residents sort of subjective questions about how they rate those amenities in their neighborhood to get at this in particular. In the second year, the program is then rolled out to the remaining eligible wards. We go to full rollout immediately after our end line. The end line, by the way, takes place after participants have been in the program for roughly 10 or 11 months in total. We then have a second end line survey, which took place after the rollout had happened completely. We're not going to use that data at all today. We're open to suggestions on how we can use it. All we actually do with that is just to observe ex post the treatment status of households in the control wards. So we know who the eligible and ineligible are in control wards. Okay, so that's the timeline. This is what randomization looks like. This is a map of Addis Ababa, the wards over which we randomized. You can see that there are some wards that are ineligible, so there has been geographic targeting. The richest households the richest wards in the city were not targeted in the first year, were not eligible for targeting in the first year. This is also the level at which we're going to have this bilateral commuting data, so between each of the pairs of wards on this map here, and that's what we're going to use. And just to kind of fix ideas a bit, the out commuting rate that we see in the data is roughly 45%. So more than half of people are working in their home ward, but there is a lot of out commuting as well. Okay, so I'm moving quickly on to the reduced form. Something quite simple that we can do here, just comparing individuals now, individuals I, and comparing individuals who live in treated wards to those that live in untreated wards. This would be the standard reduced form approach to estimating the effects of these kinds of programs. And of course, we can include a whole range of controls and baseline measures of the outcome of interest. We can then repeat this exercise for these ineligible and ineligible households separately. So comparing people who are actually in the program to those that are not. But I'm going to start with the ITT effects of the program first here in panel A. So the first 3 columns here are all measures of employment as in terms of hours, as a share of total hours that we see that endowed to each individual, which we assume to be about 48 hours a week. And so the main thing to take away here in columns 2 and 3 is that this program does indeed create public employment to the tune of 5% of total hours. So this is kind of 12% of total labor time in this setting. And what's really striking is that it crowds out private employment in terms of hours almost 1 for 1. Okay, so this coefficient in column 3. So people are doing the public works and reducing their private employment in almost equal measure. So the net effect on employment is very close to 0. And that's going to help us to simplify as we go forward. Also, we document this effect on amenities using the standardized index of amenity quality, expressed, of course, in standard deviation terms. So this is a about a 0.6 increase in the amenities targeted by the program. So we aren't documenting that residents of these treated warriors are noticing that things are improving due to the program. So this fourth column is at the household level, which is why the sample size is lower. So as we move now from the ITT to looking at eligible and ineligible, the first thing that's quite reassuring here in panel B is that we're seeing similar effects very close together on amenities for eligible and ineligible. So this is somewhat reassuring that this is not kind of being driven by kind of a reporting bias amongst people who actually did the work themselves. The other thing is confirmation that these ITT effects are what we're calling direct effects. So they're coming directly through the eligible households, the people who are actually doing the public works. They are the ones who are doing the public works and reducing their labor supply to the private sector. Okay, and so that's going to give us kind of our sort of first stage, the labor supply shock of about a 12% reduction in labor supply at origin for people in the program. Sorry, I shouldn't say for people in the program, for people in treated warriors, it's the ITT, it's 12%. Okay, and so you'll notice that I haven't shown anything to do with wages so far, and we're hesitant to do that precisely because we think those estimates could be subject to all sorts of biases that I alluded to earlier. So I'm going to start with a model and then come back to those as we go. So the model is nothing innovative at all. In fact, we're simplifying standard canonical models in the urban literature. We're adapting it mostly from the paper by Heblich et al., which is the one on the London metropolis. Some of the adaptations that we're using are adaptations that we have in common with the paper that I believe was presented by Melanie at the same conference last year. And so in this model, the city is comprised of n locations, which for us are going to correspond to our 90 warriors in the data. We have a fixed residential population per warrior, and each resident is going to supply labor inelastically to the private sector in the baseline case. The production side is very simple. We've just got a representative producer in each location who hires labor with demand elasticity of alpha. And then crucially, workers can commute in this model, so they can choose their place of work, and where pi ij is going to denote the proportion of residents from I who work in labor market J. So throughout, we're going to be talking about residences I and destination labor markets J. Now, there are two major simplifying assumptions in the paper, which are perhaps going to be the most controversial. Firstly, we're assuming the workers cannot migrate, so they can't choose where to live in this model. Now, we think this is justified, firstly, because we see no effects of the program on migration decisions of people in our sample and no effects on rent. In fact, residential mobility in this setting is extremely low to begin with. I think we see about 1.5% of our sample changing their place of residence at all in the year over which we study this. Okay, so we don't think that this is a problem in this setting. The other thing is that these households are generally isolated from changes in the housing market or changes in rents in the housing market, because most of them live in these central city informal settlements where they pay close to no rents. In addition, we're assuming a frictionless trade of a single good across the city, which means that we're shutting down any possibility of price effects from this program. So to justify this, we've carefully compiled detailed CPI data, which we've geo-referenced 2 locations in the city. We got the statistical agency to tell us where they collected the CPI data from. And so using that data and our exposure measures that I'll get to in a minute, we find no impact on prices using that data. This is also an urban context where most of the goods that are consumed are likely to be imported either from outside of the country or from the rural hinterland. And non-tradable goods make up a very tiny proportion of total consumption for these households. So further to justify that decision. Notationally, we're going to, throughout what we show you, we're going to use this exact hat algebra that's commonly used in this literature to donate objects in proportional changes from the baseline equilibrium once we move to a world with public works.
Before you move on, so Gabriel had a question about migration and rents. That's probably works.
Sure.
I was wondering if there is some interest in the long run, if there'll be some interesting dynamics with some gentrification pressures, if these amenities are valued more by high-income households.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I mean, indeed, this paper we're referencing about Bologna et al. Is getting at exactly that problem. One point to make here, I mean, it is a valid concern. One point is that, you know, the people knew that this program was going to be rolled out across the rest of the city after 1 year, and so we think it, you know, it'd be a little bit myopic perhaps to change your place of residence to take advantage of these amenities only. So, you know, we're estimating fairly large amenity effects, but perhaps not that large. Okay.
Simon, I think there were some questions about the extensive margin as well. So it's going back a bit in the flow. So, but
yeah, okay, I can. Yeah, so that's a good point. So no changes in hours, in total hours here, but at the extensive margin, this program is creating employment. Okay, so because of what I told you earlier, the hours per day done on the program is very low, and so the net effect on total employment is positive, but the effect on hours is close to zero. Okay, so what we're seeing basically is people who were kind of heterogeneous at baseline. Some of them weren't working at all and entered the labor market with the public works and therefore increased their hours. And then we saw some people who were working longer hours in the private sector who cut those hours entirely when they joined the program. So the net effect is close to zero on hours, but the effect on employment here is positive. And the effect on the extensive margin of private employment is fairly similar to what we see in terms of hours.
I'm not totally sure if that addresses Simon's question. So
okay.
Do you want to chime in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it helps. I think the part that I was having a hard time squaring is, I think earlier you said take up was something like 98%. And so, you know, given that the employment rates are so low and take up is so high, I would have thought that the treatment effects would have been bigger unless there's some kind of spillover story that you're going to get into.
Okay, so just one point is that, yeah, these results are at the individual level when the program is targeted at the household level. So households are choosing which individual in their household who will join the program. So that's also part of it. So we're kind of diluting whatever effect size you imagine occurring at the household level. It's diluted by 4 or 5 because there are 4 or 5 adult members of these households on average. So I don't know if that perhaps answers the question, but this does square with the hours that we see people doing per day in public works, and the changes in extensive margin employment, which are there at the household and the individual level. Okay, so quickly, this is what utility looks like for a worker, and this is characterized by the choice of place of living and place of working, and combines the amenities that are constant regardless of where you work, but are determined by where you live, by your home location I. The TAUs, which are these iceberg commuting costs from I to J, and then the wages that you earn if you commute to J. And then, of course, there's little b ij, which is this this shock drawn from the Frechet distribution, the familiar Frechet distribution in these models with the dispersion parameter theta. Okay, so that's the choice facing workers, and these models give these very nice solutions to the workers' commuting decisions. The conditional commuting probabilities are then given by this expression here, kind of reflecting the relative attractiveness of commuting to a particular destination against all other possible destinations. And what's nice about these expressions is that we can easily take logs and then express that as a gravity equation, both in terms of the commuting costs and the wages at destination, where that elasticity of commuting is going to be the parameter theta. And so that's going to be quite easy for us to estimate in our data. These models also generate these quite nice functional forms in terms of indirect utility for workers at living in a particular location. And so in the paper, we characterize that using the standard approach, and then we're going to introduce into that equilibrium the public works program. So the program is giving workers in an area the opportunity to take up this work, which is done locally, so without commuting costs, for P part of their time, okay? And so that's that fixed P that they're dedicating to the program, and at a wage that offers quite a large premium on the existing market wages in this economy. And because of this large premium, this is going to generate full take-up, so everyone's going to take up the full P hours that are available to them. This is going to have three effects on the equilibrium in this model. Firstly, direct effects on labor income in treated areas. So that's going to be this wage premium that you earn from doing the public works times the time you spend on the public works, but it also includes this crowd out effect, so this reduction in earnings from the private sector because you're reducing your private labor supply. Okay, and so this is the net effect of the program VI on treated individuals, again, expressed in proportional terms relative to the baseline equilibrium. Secondly, we're going to go, the model is going to say that the program reduces labor supply to the market and therefore increases wages everywhere. So now we characterize things in terms of destination labor markets W, and we're going to say that the extent to which wages in a destination are affected by the program is going to be given by this expression here, the proportional reduction in commuters into that labor market as a result of the program being rolled out or not in their home location I. And so P goes in here directly, so they're taking up the program completely if their warrior is treated, and that's then expressed in proportional terms. So again, this P is an ITT. This is a representative individual. Of course, there are some people who are in the program who are not, and that's kind of assumed away at this stage in the modeling. So P is the proportion of time on the program of the representative individual in the model. And finally, the program is going to improve amenities where the public works is done. Okay, so we're imposing this assumption that these amenity improvements only accrue to places where the program is actually rolled out rather than spilling over in any way. And then finally, we kind of embed these changes into the standard expression for welfare, the change in welfare that is, U hat I, using the changes that we've made from the public works. And so that expression is composed of the amenity effect, the improvements in amenities in that neighborhood, which enters multiplicatively, the direct effect, which is going to be quite easy for us to characterize. This -1 is, of course, the crowd out effect, the reduction in labor supply P for people in treated warriors. And then the wage effect, which could be present for any individual in the city, regardless of their location I, because anyone can have access to these wage increases at WJ, which we're going to estimate. Okay, and so it's a nice property of these models that the utility that you get in the baseline case is kind of a commuter market access weighted measure of wages in the city, and that's going to simplify in our case to being kind of the baseline commuting probabilities IJ times these changes in wages at destinations to which everyone has access. Okay. So that's what the model tells us we need to go after. The direct effects we're going to be able to calibrate quite easily and use estimates from the model to check those. Sorry, use estimates from the reduced form to check those. But this tells us that we need to quantify three main things in particular. So firstly, we need to back out these labor market spillovers, these W hat J's. We need to get a value for the improvement in amenities due to the program. And then we need to estimate theta, this commuting elasticity, the fresh air parameter, in order to solve for this. So I'm going to take each of those in turn. The trickiest one is how we estimate these labor market spillovers. So let's say we started from the simple reduced form version of this, and we regressed wages in warrior I, so at place of residence I, on whether or not the warrior itself is treated. What we'd say is that that's the wrong approach, and the model tells us exactly why. The model, this expression that I've already showed you, tells us that we rather need to think about wages in terms of where people work, because people from control warriors might be commuting in to treated warriors, and so we want to pick that up in the data. And secondly, we need to characterize the treatment as kind of an exposure measure, as a function of the proportional reduction in labor supply to that destination, right? Because we're seeing possibly changes in commuting flows out of treated warriors due to the program.
Before you keep going, Paul had a question about firms, which I think.
Yeah, sure. So you haven't showed us sort of how you guys are thinking about the supply side. And so I was wondering in particular, sort of what impact you think higher local incomes are going to have on local firms. And so, you know, there's a view that since prices didn't change, that's all that matters. And there's also a view that sort of independent of prices, demand is going to matter. So just wondering how you think about the setting.
Yeah, thanks. That's an important question. I mean, we haven't, well, we've certainly thought about it, but we haven't done anything yet to look at what's happening to firms and what the effects of these prices are. So it's something we're thinking about. We're trying to put together the best form of data that we can, but haven't yet made progress on. We might shed some more light on that when I start to talk about different sectors in the economy, and maybe that'll be one route to start to get at that question. Okay, so going from the model to the data, what we're going to do is exactly what the model tells us to do. Luckily, we can look at wages at destination. So this is why it's important to know wages at the individual level together with the commuting flows, the commuting decisions of workers. So we know what wages are at WJ. And then we're going to regress that on our measure of exposure to the program at destination J. This exposure is parameterized just like this. So lambda ij is now the share of workers at J that came from I. So we're capturing this idea of the change in the share of workers coming into a labor market. And we're just simplifying here by putting in the treatment status of these origin warriors. Of course, we're looking in the background there as this P, this reduction in labor supply that comes from a treated warrior, which we're assuming is homogeneous. Okay, so that's going to be our exposure measure, which is what we're going to use for our main estimates. Now, it's important just to note that we need to recenter this measure, even though treatment I is randomly assigned. It is not the case that exposure is randomly assigned. Some locations, by virtue of their particular geography or connectedness by commuting flows, are not going to have kind of equal expected exposure. Okay, and so we need to recenter by re-randomizing treatment assignment at the level of I, and then recenter our measure using this method by Boryasuk and Hull. And they, of course, also recommend using randomization inference when doing any of this kind of estimation, which we're going to do as well. Okay, so that takes us right on to this measure of exposure overlaid over the treatment status at the warrior level. And so what this shows is that indeed treated warriors are more exposed to the program than untreated warriors, as you would expect. But there is quite a lot of variation now, both within treated and untreated warriors in terms of how exposed they are by virtue of their commuting connectivity in the data. Okay, and so we're gonna estimate these effects on labor market wages. Firstly, in column 1, I'm showing you this kind of naive reduced form approach. And in column 2, our preferred estimate, which uses the exposure measure and wages at destination. And as we expected, this estimate using our preferred approach is considerably larger once we've taken into account all of these commuting flows, okay? And so one other point to note is, of course, exposures. So full exposure to the program implies a 20% increase in private sector wages. But of course, no warrior, at least in partial rollout, is completely exposed to the program. So we can use this estimate to then estimate the wages, the increase in wages at each destination J. And we get an average increase of 15% in treated warriors and 3.3% in control warrior labor markets. And unsurprisingly, I think the reduced form estimate falls somewhere close to the difference between the two of those things. Okay, those two averages across treatment and control. We can do kind of a back of the envelope sanity check here, remembering, of course, that the labor demand shock with full exposure is about 12%, which gives us an implied elasticity of labor demand of about 0.6, which we think is quite reasonable. So the next step, this is now labor market spillover is done for now. We're going to now turn to the amenity effects. And what we want to do is put a number on what we showed you so far. All we're going to do here, it's quite simple, is run hedonic regressions of our measure of amenities on rents in the data.
David McKenzie has a question on the previous slide.
Hi, I was just asking, can you actually reject then that the reduced form's not giving you exactly what you want in the end? Like, aren't these estimates that, when I look at the standard errors and look at the things, aren't they pretty much telling me the same thing?
I think not. Firstly, because they are underestimating the treatment effects in treated warriors. So we're getting an estimate of 11% rather than what the model tells us is actually 15%.
Right, but there's an uncertainty in both of those. So, your confidence interval for the, in column 1 is from, 4% to 17% or something. So, are we, I guess, it's encouraging in some sense. This is great news for the rest of us. Maybe, your paper says we can do all this stuff and then we can forget about it and not have to do it in the past. But I guess the question is, are we actually, are these spillovers and things just happening to balance out, or is it really, am I missing something here?
Yeah, you're okay. You're right. I right just suppose about the uncertainty of the estimates, but we do, the model tells us that we should see these spillover effects to untreated areas, and indeed is telling us that they are there. And then when we go to kind of quantifying this in terms of welfare effects, it's going to say that it's important. Whether we can conclusively rule out that they are zero, I'm not quite sure.
If I might jump in really quickly, I think here, David, you were thinking about comparing this 11% to 15%, but I think we are very much comparing 11% to 20%. And the reason is going to be clear later in the talk, but we're interested in the full scale effect. Right? So if you, so when exposure is 1, basically, rather than thinking about just the partial effect. So basically, right. 11% is much further from what might happen if you roll up.
Yeah, I think that's maybe a better answer than mine. The first column is showing per unit of exposure an 11% increase, and the second column is a per unit of exposure of 20%. And we have in a partial rollout, we have the same amount of total exposure, and when we go to scale, that's going to ramp up. Yeah, so I think we could.
But sorry, just to follow up on that again, maybe there's a formal test because that 20% has quite a big standard error on it. Plus, there's modeling error and things, and then there's an error on that. So is 20 different from 11?
Okay, no, I think that's a good point, and I think we'll have to go in and see what test we can devise to test that formally. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so quickly, rents. What we're doing here is looking at rents in the baseline, and also in another data set that I have for Addis Ababa, which is also geo-referenced, and so we can kind of correlate this at the neighborhood level in two different ways. We're throwing in as many controls as we can through a double lasso procedure, and showing that this neighborhood quality index that we've used is correlated with rents. And what that's going to allow us to do is to go from this 0.6 standard deviation effect on our index to an estimate that amenities improved by 2.5% as a result of the program in terms of kind of a hedonic measure. So that's amenities. And finally, theta, we derived from the model this gravity equation earlier. And we're going to estimate that in a couple of ways. The way we prefer to do that is to estimate this gravity with respect to wages. And what's really nice is that we can instrument those wages using our experiment. So using this exact approach that I've just shown you, and of course, including these origin fixed effects to control for all of these things. And so that's going to be our preferred way to estimate this gravity equation, which we think is quite nice to have this instrument. The alternative approach, which is usually used in the literature, is to estimate this elasticity with respect to commuting costs, where we can use walking distance as an instrument or Euclidean distance as an instrument, which is standard in the literature. So we have to use a Poisson regression here because our commuting matrix is somewhat sparse, and that result is here in the second column. This 3.36 estimate, which is a little bit smaller than what Hebler et al. Estimate for London, but within a reasonable range, we think. Okay. So we're back to welfare, and let me try and put it all together quite quickly. We've got our estimate for amenities. We've got our labor supply shock P, the direct effects parameterized by this premium on public works, our WJs, which are estimated. We're using, of course, pi ij, which are baseline commuting probabilities to deal with any kind of endogenous changes to commuting decisions. And putting that all together, we get the following. So we're going to start in partial equilibrium, partial rollout, where we can look at control worriters and treatment worriters separately. What we find is, of course, there's no direct effect in control areas, and the 6% increase through the wages of the program for treated worriters. We then introduce the wage effects, which are really large, 10% for treated areas and 5% for control areas. And so that's further going to magnify the effects of the program, and then adding in the amenity, which enters multiplicatively, we get this estimate here of 19%. We then want to take this to full rollout of the program. And so what we're going to do there is just re-estimate these WJs now with full exposure in the model, and all worriters will be assumed to be treated. So we're just going to set TI equal to 1 for everyone. And so this kind of gets to David's question. Exposure now jumps from these two means to 1 everywhere. And that's going to mean that the model tells us that these wage effects are going to be significantly magnified. Well, of course, the direct effects and amenity effects remain constant in treated worriters. Now, if you're a bit uncomfortable with these kind of these welfare numbers, which are of course highly parameterized, one way to convince you is to show this benchmarked against a cash transfer. So we're just parameterizing the cash transfer as kind of the same transfer as the earnings from the public works, and just kind of giving that to people in the model, and then comparing that to what we see. And so the first thing to note is that the cash transfer is better than the direct effects, because there isn't this kind of 30% crowd out effect from the reduction in labor supply that we see on the earnings side. Okay, and so that would tell you that, okay, public works are costly because of this time cost to the beneficiaries. But when we add in the wage effects and the amenity effects, then those indirect effects, the public works becomes a lot more attractive. And again, if you're uncomfortable with welfare measures, we conduct a very similar exercise using income alone, and it tells a very similar story in terms of these effects. Okay, so I'm very quickly going to talk about heterogeneity. There's a lot that we could do here. What I'm going to show you now is just wage and self-employment separately. So what we're going to do is just run all of the estimation that we've done so far, kind of treating these two types of work as hermetically sealed, separate parts of the labor market. And the effects could differ for a number of reasons. One, the labor supply shock could be different. So people could differentially reduce their labor supply as a direct effect of the program to different parts of the sector. There could be different commuting probabilities here. So the propagation of the shocks could be different across space. And then there could be a different labor demand elasticity governing the sensitivity of wages. So just in descriptive statistics to set the stage, wage employment is more common in this setting. It's 76% of total employment. Wage employment exhibits higher out commuting rates. So people are commuting, more likely to commute out of their local woreda, and their average commuting times are significantly further in wage employment. Okay, so this gives us the sense that the shocks through wage employment are likely to propagate further. But the shock we're going to find is larger for self-employment because the people who happen to take up the public works are disproportionately likely to otherwise have been doing public works. And we can show that descriptively in the data. So the estimated P, the proportional change in labor supply due to the program, is double for self-employment relative to wage. And therefore, in terms of our exposure measures, there's going to be less spatial dispersion for self-employment relative to wage employment. The effects are the exposure is going to remain more kind of tightly clustered in the actual treated workers. Then when we run our estimation, we're going to get these effects here. The average effects of self-employment are significantly larger, but they are, as we suspected, are more geographically contained. And so the effects on average for wage employment we're seeing are a lot smaller, but are spilling over in equal measure to control areas. And using that, we can then back out these implied labor demand elasticities, showing again that self-employment appears to be more sensitive in terms of how wages respond to this labor supply shock. Okay, so that's all we're going to have time for in terms of heterogeneity, and there's a lot more that we want to do here and are planning to do. Let me conclude. I won't tell you again what we've done. We've evaluated this public works program, and we've combined that with a spatial equilibrium framework. Benchmarking against the equivalent of a cash transfer initially would tell you that public works has lower effects because it's crowding out the private labor supply and therefore reducing the net benefits to beneficiaries. But the welfare gains from public works are magnified 4 times once we include these indirect effects, the combination of amenities and wage effects. And these effects are magnified further when the program is fully rolled out, so that public works looks much better than cash once we're in the full rollout equilibrium.
So Paul Nierhaus had a question about how to scale up those welfare.
Sure. I mean, Clement has sort of partially answered it. And my point is that I think, especially if you're making the comparisons to cash transfers, then you know, in the welfare analysis, you got to value the cost to employers of higher wages as well as the benefits to the poor. And it makes sense that you want to understand impacts on the poor. But, if they're sort of employers are implicitly paying part of this, then the cash transfer you want to think about might be one in which you tax those guys by that additional amount. That might be the relevant benchmark for that comparison, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you. No, I think that point is entirely taken, and it's the next step for us to think about in terms of this full calculation. Thank you. We can talk about this for a while in the time that remains. I just kind of want to end on one note, which is kind of about whether we think about social programs as having any there's any sense in trying to geographically target social programs, or whether we think that those effects are kind of just going to dissipate widely. So it's certainly true that that the wage effects are spilling over across neighborhoods, and we're seeing that in the data. but the effects are much larger in treated areas. So there is an extent to which local labor markets, well, labor markets in this setting are local, even within a large, highly connected metropolis like this. And so I think we're saying something here about what labor markets look like within a city like this. You know, it's a place where people do commute out of their local warada, but walking to work is still the most common mode of transport. And so there is some sense of localness to these labor markets. And there's therefore a sense in which we can think about geographic targeting sticking, not just in terms of the direct benefits, but also in terms of these labor markets below us that we're documenting here. They don't stick entirely, but more than one might think in a highly interconnected metropolis. And there's more to do there, of course, thinking about different ways to run counterfactuals in terms of targeting rules and decisions, and that's something that's going to follow. So let me conclude there. Thank you very much for your attention, and hopefully we have a couple of minutes left.
Sio Jayachandran, raise your hand.
Oh, I just typed my question, which is just on that last point you made. I guess it seems relevant that these are just 1 year changes. If I'm understanding you correctly, like people anticipated that in a year, their labor market would get the program. So I don't know if, yeah, am I misinterpreting, or is this not kind of, it's hard to extrapolate to permanent, you know, if this were a permanent change in wages, there might be more resorting.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually, and something for us to think about. You're right. It's almost surprising that as many people respond in terms of their commuting flows to this labor, the change in wages that we see, given that it's a one year thing. I mean, I think we think that people anticipate it, but perhaps not entirely. Like, we asked people in the data, and most people knew that it was coming in the second year, but not all. But yeah, it's something for us to think about.
Maybe another aspect of this, and might be relevant for considering, for example, an urban guarantee in India, which is like that actually this program is also was sort of rolled out, but was not meant to be a permanent program. I mean, I guess Simon, you know more about that.
Yeah, so this program is actually meant to last for 3 years for the beneficiaries, and that may affect the findings as well. Yeah, so they're meant to be enrolled for 3 years, at which point the program is going to end, and they're going to graduate from the program. Seen a couple of other raised hands.
Hi, I just had a quick question. I really like this paper a lot, and I was just thinking as you were presenting it, and it almost seems serendipitous that total employment stayed fixed, because then you have this effect on the private wages, which is something that we can measure and quantify and talk about. I'm just wondering how you might think about extending this to other cases. Let's say there was massive involuntary unemployment or labor leisure choices of some kind. Employment reacts elastically, then you wouldn't see the private wages, right? What would be your methodology for then teasing out the indirect welfare effects in such situations? There must be some of that in some waradas here at least, right? So are we missing some stuff there and how would you handle it?
That's a good question. So our framework did allow that, and we kind of took it out to simplify somewhat. So, but it does involve a little bit of fudge with the math to kind of introduce a possible endogenous change in the labor supply, total labor supply, which we have assumed away in this presentation. But we'd have to think about adapting our framework to incorporate these other examples. I don't know if Clement, if you have any thoughts on that.
Sorry, I was responding to the chat at the same time. I couldn't. Yeah, I'd rather. Was it on the labor supply? No.
Sorry, no. We're just
doesn't matter. Thinking about. We can talk about it later.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
So on the,
I guess the non-tradable goods, I guess you said that they're not big in the consumption bundle, but I presume they're not tiny either, and there presumably have to be effects on those prices. Maybe the estimates are noisy, but like a haircut or something like that, often consumed locally as well. I guess, especially when you scale this up to the whole city, presumably we need to take account of those.
Indeed, yeah. So we have that in the CPI data, which is quite nice. We have beauty treatments, salon treatments, and haircuts. I think, and a couple of other things. And you're right; they're not zero as a percentage of consumption bundles. We do try to estimate price effects on those particular things. You're right; estimates are quite noisy, but nothing large there at least. So yeah, I think what we should do there is try and kind of bound our effects by trying to think about the largest effect size we can detect on non-tradables.
Great. So thanks so much for a great presentation and for a great conversation in the chat. And thanks to the audience members for participating. And so now we have an hour break for whatever meal it is, wherever you are. And we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, now I gave 2 minutes. So let's continue now with the third session. So this will be from 1:30 to 2:30. We will do 10 minutes, no questions. And then you will be able to ask all the questions in the chat as we did before, and I will just call some of them and you can respond, Rema, if you want here over the chat. The floor is yours, Sven.
Okay, thank you very much. So the title of this talk is Food versus Food Stamps, Evidence from an At-Scale Experiment in Indonesia. This is joint work with Abhijit Banerjee, Rema Hanna, who's here, and our colleagues Elan, Satriawan, and Sudarno Sumarto from the Gadjah Mada University, Semeru, and TMP Duaka, which is part of the Indonesian government. And we want to gratefully acknowledge funding support from the Australian government, USAID, and the JPAL Governance Initiative. So by way of introduction, there are two broad approaches to the delivery of targeted food assistance programs, right? So, conditional on wanting to deliver food to people, you can give it out in kind, right? You can deliver actual food to beneficiaries. And there are lots of examples like the India public distribution system or programs in Egypt, or, most recently in the United States, the Farmers to Families food boxes, which you may have heard about. So one option is just giving the food in kind. Another option is you can do a voucher, right? So, and then individuals who get the voucher could use the voucher to purchase food on the private market. So again, there are examples of these in both the developing world and in the US. You've probably heard of the food stamps or SNAP program. And so, how do we think about kind of the differences between in-kind programs and voucher-based programs? So starting from kind of like a basic price theory perspective, economists, I think, would typically consider 3 sets of issues. So one is how they might affect people's consumption decisions. So typically, vouchers are more flexible than in-kind, right? In-kind, the government gives you a particular type of food, and vouchers, generically speaking, you can go and use it to buy, have a little bit more choice. And so that may constrain your consumption decisions. If your consumption kind of absent the voucher or absent the program would be less than kind of what they're giving you with the in-kind program, that might affect your net consumption decisions because you're sort of, if you want to consume it, you have to consume the particular thing they give you, or at least it might be hard to resell it. A second thing that we might think about is price effects. So particularly in isolated areas, if the sort of supply of whatever this good is inelastic, you can think of an in-kind program as a positive supply shock, where the government is sort of bringing in the food or whatever it is, and that may reduce prices. So, Code a paper on this, Kunha et al. Have examined this issue. Another related issue with prices is that in-kind programs, if they basically fix the quantity they are being given out, whereas vouchers fix the price, in-kind programs that might provide insurance against price shocks, and Gaden et al. Have a paper that sort of illustrates some of these ideas. And a third issue that you might think about for comparing in-kind versus voucher programs is the idea of self-targeting. And so if the in-kind food the government is giving out is inferior, that may improve targeting through self-selection. Like the rich don't really want this kind of low-quality food, so maybe they won't select into the program. So those are all 3 things that I think the literature has sort of thought about in different ways. What we want to sort of talk about in this paper is what we think of as a 4th potential important difference between these 2 types of programs. And that is, particularly in low capacity settings, there may be important differences in the ability of governments to actually administer these programs. And we think these administrative differences may actually be first order. So for example, you're going to have much more, you may have much more control over the administration of program because food is divisible, right? So you can take a given amount of food, just subdivide it up, but a debit card with your name on it, for example, is not divisible. You can't cut the debit card in half, and obviously it no longer works. It may be easier for the refill process may be easier. For example, it may be easier for the government to kind of refill the electronic voucher every month rather than moving millions of tons of rice or whatever physically kind of around the country. And these might have important implications for leakages as well. Okay, so those are some, we think that's sort of a fourth set of issues that we want to think about in this paper. So what we're going to do is we're going to study the switch from an in-kind program to an electronic food voucher program in Indonesia that began in 2018. So the existing program, and I'll talk more about them in a few slides, but the existing program gave 10 kilos per month of free government-provided rice. And the new voucher program created a digital voucher with debit card that was redeemable for an approximately equivalent amount of rice or eggs at a network of private agents throughout the country. And it's important to note that eligibility rules for these programs don't change. So it's approximately equivalent amounts of money to essentially the same people, but it switches from an in-kind program to a voucher-based program. One kind of an exciting aspect of this project, this is an example of randomization at scale. So because we're working with the government, we're working, and I'll describe this in a few slides as well, the government was rolling out this transition, and essentially what we did is work with the government to randomize the order of the rollout at the district level. So the government is, the treatment unit is going to be entire districts, which are going to switch from in-kind to the voucher program. The average population of a district is about 500,000 people, and we're going to have 105 districts in our experimental sample, which are going to be phased in kind of between 2018 and 2019. So that's about together those districts have about 3.4 million beneficiary households, or about 53 million people total. So the kind of pretty large scale of this, moving a whole district over at a time, allows us to measure kind of, GE effects and administration in a real world setting. And I should say, this is not an area where, the researchers were heavily involved in every micro aspect of this. This was, a large scale government program. And the main thing that we did is work with the government to sort of randomize the order in which they sort of districts were turned on in the new program. Another, I think, pretty exciting thing about this project is that we were able, because we were working with the government to evaluate this program at scale, we were able to write a special module that was integrated into 3 waves of the Indonesian National Sample Survey, the Susunas, which surveys about 300,000 households annually. And you'll see why this is important. And in addition, the Susunas contains your individual, unique identifier, your national identifier, and the government was able to merge in the unique identifiers with administrative program data on eligibility. And in particular, we'll be able to have access to baseline proxy means test scores. So, the government sort of did this merge and then provided us with the de-identified data. But the key is this data, once they had done the merge, allows us to sort of split and look at effects heterogeneously based on people's pre-period proxy means test scores. And the thing which you'll see throughout the paper is we're gonna compare households who have a proxy means test score less than 30. I'll tell you what that means later. But you can think of those as primarily the eligible group versus everybody else. And so those are the 2 groups that we're gonna focus on as we go along. And so we'll use this to evaluate the program impacts on the total amount of aid received, poverty, and then as well as some other things which are sort of going to be you'll see our administrative measures, as well as some of the other issues that I talked about before, like consumption patterns, food prices, and leakages. So just to give you a preview of results, what we find are pretty substantial changes in the allocation of aid. In particular, what we find is that the vouchers provided concentrated assistance to the targeted households. So on net, kind of the targeted group of households are receiving 45% more assistance in the voucher areas than in the in-kind districts. This is not just driven by a reduction of program leakage. Instead, what's happening is that in the in-kind areas, the food was spread around to many households, particularly ineligible households, and in the vouchers basically were not. Okay, and in particular, conditional on receiving assistance, households who received assistance in a voucher area received 84% more in subsidy than those who received assistance in the in-kind area. And it's also worth noting, this is despite the fact that actually the food, as we'll show you, was higher quality in the voucher areas, right? So despite that, they actually got better quality food, but nevertheless, it was better targeted to the poor. And so in this case, this is a case where the administrative benefits of the vouchers kind of swamp the self-targeting properties that you might have thought would have been there from kind of lower quality food. As a result of this, this actually translates, this additional aid they're able to deliver to the poor actually results in a meaningful reduction in poverty. So in households who were in the bottom 15% baseline, the fraction kind of below the government poverty line falls by about 20%. So that's kind of the administration part. We then look at some of the other kind of aspects of things you might be interested in. So we do look at sort of changes in the type of food consumed. So the key thing is that the vouchers allow households to purchase higher quality rice, so they change the composition within rice. And the other thing we find is that the vouchers allowed you to do rice and eggs and not just rice. We find this leads to a net increase in your total consumption of eggs, egg-based proteins, but not of other types of food. And what's interesting is that like it was just the vouchers had rice and eggs, and what we see is an increase in eggs. We don't see an increase in like chicken or beef or fish or vegetables or whatever. So it's not like this is just like an overall angle curve. Here it looks like it's most likely probably something about stickiness for kind of what's included in the vouchers. We don't see any kind of general equilibrium price effects on prices. There's a modest increase kind of in really remote villages, but I'll show you that kind of depends on how it's pretty modest, and it's sort of only one way you look at it. So we're not seeing kind of like major price changes, at least in this context. The other thing I'll just note is the voucher also was substantially cheaper. So it costs only between 25 and 50%. Both of these are actually not particularly administratively expensive programs to run, but the vouchers also were cheaper. So it wasn't like it was very expensive for the government to do. So in net, the results that suggest this change from kind of in-kind to vouchers led to really substantial impacts through the way it changed how these programs were implemented on the ground. Okay, so the outline of the rest of the talk is as follows. I'll talk you through the setting, experimental design, and data, and then I'll kind of go through these 5 or 6, I guess, dimensions of results on social assistance, poverty impacts, consumption decisions, prices, leakage, and program costs. Okay, so what do you need to know about the 2 different programs we're studying here? So the original program is called the raster program. It's a program that we have actually studied in previous work. This program was started about 20 years ago during the Asian financial crisis with various modifications over the year. The government spends between, I don't know, around $1.5 billion US in this program per year. And the program delivered in the final iteration that we're studying 10 kilos of free rice per month to about 15 million households every month. And it was worth about 100,000 rupiah, or about US $8 per month. It fluctuates a bit depending on the market price. Price was around 10,000 rupiah per kilo in our period. And this is about 6.5% of the poverty line for a family of 4. The eligibility for this program was determined through a proxy means test run by the central government, with the list distributed to villages through the Ministry of Social Affairs. Villages were allowed to make some change to this list during a village meeting. But the proxy means test was the key eligibility determinant. And the rice was procured by the central government logistics agency known as Bulag, and then delivered to the village, often in 50-kilogram sacks like this over here. This literally says produced by government entity, government company Bulag. So that's an example of government rice. The village then takes these big sacks and subdivides it and distributes it to its beneficiaries, and it's supposed to make sort of 10-kilo sacks and distribute it to the beneficiaries. But as we've documented in previous work, the rice was often kind of shared much more widely. The villages often had a preference to sort of say, we're going to distribute, like, instead of giving 10 kilos to the poor, we'll give 3 kilos to everybody or something like that. So the new program was a voucher-based program, and it was, I think, Indonesia's largest social assistance reform in 20 years. And they produced a monthly voucher of 110,000 per month. So it's 110 versus 100. It's a little 10% bigger, but it's approximately similar. And it was redeemable for rice and eggs. And it was saleable in principle, like you could say, if you don't redeem your voucher that month, it's there. It continues the next month, although that wasn't really particularly encouraged. And in principle, it had the same eligibility rules as the raster program. The administration was a debit card, which was issued to the female adult in the household, if there was a female in the household, by the banks, and it was redeemable for purchase, not for cash, at a network of bank agents throughout the country, using these like debit card machines over here. And this is an example of a typical agent. So you can see the government logo for the program. This is like says a transaction place for the program was called BPNT, which literally stands for non-cash food assistance. They wanted to be clear it was not cash. And here's the little logo with the rice and the eggs. And it's a typical store that you've probably seen lots of. The government stood up a network, a pretty big network of this. Their goal was to have 1 agent per 250 beneficiaries with a minimum of 2 agents per village. And by March of 2019, which is kind of our end line period of our experiment, there were about 9,000 agents total in our treatment area, or about 1 per 135 beneficiaries on average. So it's a pretty dense network. And essentially, you should think of these as small neighborhood shops. 99% of them were sort of 99% of the distribution points were these like small private shops who were also remote banking agents. And the agents themselves, in general, are allowed to source the rice and eggs from anywhere on the open market, though there was some pressure to buy them from logistics agencies. In general, they were able to sort of source them from anywhere. So what's our experimental design? So what was happening was basically the sort of status here is that the government was rolling out this program. They started as a pilot in 44 cities in 2017. They then basically sort of divided the country into districts of 3 phases, like you think phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, based on kind of their overall readiness. Phase 1 went first, and then in phase 2, I guess in phase 2, I think, the government was going to do some of the rollout into 2018, but they didn't have enough budget to sort of hit all of those districts in that phase in 2018. So actually, they came to us and suggested, well, gee, maybe we could randomize among those districts to allow us to do an impact evaluation. So that's what we did. So we're focused on these 105 districts, kind of in that, broadly speaking, kind of middle priority group. There are 42, so we randomly chose 42 of those districts for treatment, 63 districts for control, and then they were subdivided into 3 waves for rollout, May, October, and November of 2018. This is not, I'm going to pool this in general for almost everything, but it doesn't really matter. You can break down the results separately by wave, and the results are very similar. The only sort of notes on this is a little bit of the government wanted to come, they had a budget for 10 million people and they wanted to hit 10 million people. So the way we had to deal with this is we stratified most districts by geography. The 20 districts with the smallest numbers of beneficiary put in a special stratum, randomized them, and then basically treated them until we kind of hit the beneficiary cap. This doesn't actually matter, but it just means we need fixed effects in all analysis. You can actually drop this whole strata and the results don't really change. Control districts were treated in June 2019. So I'll show you a timeline of this in a moment. Okay, so that's basically the randomization, 42 districts in the treatment, 63 control, and then into these 3 waves. So the treatment districts have about 1.2 million beneficiary households. This just shows you a map of Indonesia to sort of show you kind of that this was pretty geographically dispersed. A lot in Sumatra, some in areas in West Java and East Java, some in kind of Bali and Nusa Tenggara, and then some in Kalimantan and Sulawesi. And just for those of you who don't know, that Indonesia is quite big. So to go from Jakarta to kind of these districts over here would be like a 3-hour plane flight. From Jakarta to kind of Sulawesi over here is like a 4-hour plane flight. So this is a pretty kind of like vast geographic expanse, which is related to kind of the data collection strategy that we're using. So in some sense, the only kind of feasible way we could collect data on this is to work with government collected data. So we work with the government to design a special module for the SUSINAS, the National Sample Survey, which is a repeated cross-section of 250,000 households annually that the government does every year, which, by the way, if you've never worked with it, it's a terrific data set. We have data on the receipt of both types of transfers, so the amounts of subsidized rice or eggs, prices and quantities, and a subjective quality assessment of the rice. And then they also ask kind of a very detailed consumption module, like a typical one of those 300-question consumption modules to everybody, separate from sort of the analysis, the questions on the subsidized program. In addition, we'll use the government targeting database, or their unified database. That's data that was collected a couple of years previously, so in 2015, on about 25 million poor and near poor households that was used for the targeting of these programs. And that has some data on household composition, assets, and a proxy means test score. And we'll focus on using the proxy means test score. And as I mentioned, the government merged this into the SUSINAS using their national identity number and then shared the de-identified data with us. We also have some village census that provide some other village level controls. And so, essentially this is a randomized trial, so the regression is pretty straightforward. We're just going to regress, outcomes on a dummy for being a treatment area. We'll pick controls using a double lasso, kind of using all the baseline covariates, either at the household or village level, that we can merge in, and so on and so forth. Everything will be clustered by district, we'll have randomization, inference, p-values, and so on. And in terms of the timing, we're going to focus. We're going to focus on this round, this data over here. So just to give you a sense, we have some baseline data over here, not at the individual level, but at the district level. We have our sort of 3 treatment waves over here. Our key end line will be in March 2019. And then they start treating the controls kind of shortly thereafter. The other thing that will be important is because we have people's baseline proxy means test data, we pre-specify that we're going to split people into basically 2 groups. Those who have percentile scores less than 30, that means they were predicted to be in the bottom approximately 30% of the population based on their proxy means test, and and those with PMT scores kind of 30 or above. We'll also examine those kind of near the poverty line and so on and so forth. Okay, so to go to the results. So the first thing I want to show you is, so this looks at sort of the total amount that people receive. And this is going to be total amount of subsidy received, including zeros, right? So if you don't get anything, you're in this regression as a zero. And what you can see is that this is the likely eligible group, this is the likely ineligible group, and you basically see an increase of about 45% for the total amount received by the eligible group. And you see a decline of about 28% for the amount greater than 30. So you see a big kind of a pretty big redistribution from sort of the ineligibles to the eligibles. Okay, and as I mentioned, we have the 3 waves. These results are not decreasing over time. So if I look at the results from the sort of the very first wave compared to the third wave, they're very similar. So that's a pretty substantial reallocation of aid to this group. The other thing that's worth noting is, in general, there is a little more exclusion error kind of regardless. But what's really happening, and so the eligibles are a little less likely to get something. So that falls by about 16%. But what's happening is these ineligibles, in general, they're much less likely to receive anything, and that falls by half, right? From 29%, down to 15%. And so I think actually these graphs, I think really nicely sort of show you the results in kind of bin scatter form. So here's the proxy means test score bin. So these are your pre-period poverty scores. So this is the poorest, and then basically, the people from sort of 50 and above are sort of rarely in the data. The group that there's a large population who we have no proxy means test scores on, who in general, that's because they weren't surveying people they thought were rich. We're just going to put all the people with no scores here at the 100 bin. So what do you see here? So for the very poor, right, you see the largest increases, right, from say 32,000 to 55,000, right? So the largest two, whatever, I don't know what you call 1/20th quintiles. The bottom 5% and 5 to 10% have the largest increases, and you see increases kind of getting smaller and smaller down to about the middle, and then you see the opposite happening at the very top, where basically the people who are very high are not are getting substantially less. And then, likewise,
sorry to interrupt. So that poor Rema is answering a lot of questions. So maybe one, David, do you want to make your question here, like with the camera?
Well, Rema just answered it. I was just asking, I guess that, the question is sort of about the dynamics. I guess, we know people transit in and out of poverty a lot. The proxy means tests are, going to capture some sort of underlying approximation of that. And if people only get reassessed every 3 years, then there's obviously a lot of poor people that are getting excluded, but that you don't know are poor based on just PMT.
So that's a great question, David. So you anticipate the 2 bullet points on the bottom of the slide. So we do 2 things to look at this issue. So the first is we can actually do this exact same regression using contemporaneous consumption. So what we do is we take your consumption at end line, subtract out the benefits from the program of either type that you would get to get sort of a kind of a contemporaneous measure of consumption in the absence of the program. It's not perfect, but that's the best we can do. And we can do similar results like that. It's not nearly as stark, but you get a very similar pattern. So this is kind of like, this is the voucher version of kind on the contemporaneous measure of consumption, subtracting out program receipt of either type. And it's not quite as stark, but you see a very similar pattern. So it's still the case that the poor contemporaneously are doing a lot better on this. The second thing you can do is you can compare, again, sort of households who receive the program versus not on the 2 different programs based on their consumption. And what you can see is that the this is just that's in the BPNT areas. The ones that are receiving it are substantially poorer than the ones that are not receiving it, even conditional on their PMT scores. So it does look like it's not the case that all the kind of changes that were happening in the kind of the voucher program, we're assigning it to kind of people who were unobservably poor. It actually looks like the opposite. Thanks. Other questions while we're sort of pausing for questions, Nika?
No, you can continue.
Okay, great. All right. So that basically shows you that there's a pretty substantial increase to those in the poor. But yes, it's a really good point, and something we certainly thought a lot about. what's happening also is that the aid is much more concentrated. Okay, so this is just looking at recipients of either program. Conditional on receiving a program, you get about 84% more if you received it in the voucher area. Okay, and what's happening, this just shows you a histogram, right? Basically, this is conditional on receiving the program. If you're in an in-kind area, you get sort of these smaller amounts, right? You get kind of like, you know, amounts kind of in here. And what are these four big bars? The question we asked is how much did you get over the previous 4 months? And we said, you know, if it was in March, so you know, February, January, so on and so forth. And this bar is, I got the full 110,000 for 4 months, the full 110,000 for 3 months, for 2 months, and for 1 month. And so you can see that basically what's happening is in the voucher areas, conditional on getting it, almost everyone is getting the full amount, whereas in the in-kind areas, they're really sort of like dividing it into much smaller groups. So in some sense, what you can see is that this electronic debit card is sort of allowing them to have much more fidelity to kind of the original program design of kind of giving conditional on eligibility, giving kind of the full transfer to those people. You know, you may have thought, or one thing we were concerned about was that, you know, given this redistribution from sort of one group to another group, this could lead to a lot of kind of political protests. So we have some data about whether there were kind of protests in these villages from kind of the village census. We also have a question of whether they replaced the village head, you know, in the year sort of after this happened as sort of a measure of protest. And we don't see kind of any reactions to on either of those dimensions. So that's also sort of something that's worth noting as well. The final sort of like main outcome I'll note is that we also have this measure of rice quality. So, you know, in a big national household survey, kind of I think the best thing we could do is ask people to subjectively just assess the quality of the rice that they receive from these programs. And on a score of 1 to 3, we sort of normalize it to 0-1 scale. And what you can see is that people are, you know, substantially happier with kind of the quality of the rice that they're getting under the voucher-based program. And I think, you know, that's particularly interesting kind of with these two results together, right? In general, you think that sort of one of the properties of an in-kind program is that if it provides lower quality food, that's going to help with targeting. But here you're kind of able to get the best of both worlds. You're able to provide both higher quality rice and still end up with better targeting, kind of because those administrative benefits are sort of dominating. Okay, so that's kind of in some sense the key result of the paper is that this administrative thing, fidelity to these vouchers, really sort of targeted aid much more to the poor. So it's worth noting this is actually, you know, could this concentration kind of be large enough to affect actual poverty levels? And so just, you know, the poverty line in Indonesia is, you know, $425,000 rupiah per month per capita. It's about $1 a day, which is about the 10th percentile of the income distribution. The program is 7% of the poverty line. So, you know, but that could have a meaningful impact for households who are close to it. So we're going to kind of just measure sort of total impacts on poverty and just count kind of the fraction of people who are below the government poverty line as just based on their total kind of consumption and as a function of sort of their PMT score bins. And what you can see is a similar pattern that actually you can see poverty rates declining, particularly for those who are sort of poorer to begin with. Okay, and particularly in kind of these bottom 3 5 percentile bins. And so, you know, so if you look kind of in general for everyone in the eligible group, you know, poverty falls by 2.3%. That's kind of border, not quite statistically significant. As you get kind of lower and lower and lower into the baseline PMT scores, you can see stronger and stronger effects on poverty. So for example, for those who were, you know, the poverty rate was sort of around 10-15%. You know, if we look at the bottom 10-15% of people based on PMT scores, poverty is falling by, say, 4.3 percentage points or about 20%. So that's a pretty substantial a reduction in the fraction of people below poverty. And, you know, this is not just a function of, you know, some particular arbitrary cut in the distribution. If we look at total consumption, we find total consumption going up. You know, we can use other welfare metrics. We get sort of similar results.
Ben,
and one, sorry, let me say one last thing. And one thing that sometimes comes up is that, you know, we can also recalculate people's consumption using the quantities of rice and eggs they consume, holding the prices fixed. So this is, and we get similar results. This is not a function. This is not because like, oh, like, rice and eggs prices went up and like therefore they're mechanically measured to be richer. No, we can do it all kind of with, at least for rice and eggs, which are the things we would think would be affected, at constant prices, and results don't change. Yeah, Mika.
Yes, Debraj, do you want to make your point? Because he's comparing it with the Indian PDS, and he was wondering how you could compare this with, but Debraj, you can say it.
No, I didn't want to hold anybody up. I was just wondering, in the Indonesian case, I guess, Ben, what's happening is that this stuff is being done at the village level, and then the village is doing the distributing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was just comparing in my mind with the Indian PDS, where it seems like that baseline in-kind targeting does not take that route, and I was just trying to kind of see how it might compare.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Debraj. And so I mean, I'm not as familiar with the Indian PDS system, but my understanding is that's run by private people, whereas this is run by the government. So that could be an important difference. I think there is a couple of differences in the two different programs in the administration, and we won't be able. They're kind of all together. We won't be able to tell you exactly which of them is important, but I think there's two things going on. The first is it does move the distribution from the shop, from the government sector to the private shops. Sure. And the second is it moves it makes it on the debit card. And I think that it's kind of I mean, in some sense, I do think that those things often go together. Right, so a voucher-based program, like if you think about sort of, for example, the switch in the United States from kind of in-kind to vouchers was something that looked very similar, right? It went from kind of when the U.S. government first started handing out kind of food I think in the 1930s, it was handing out just surplus agricultural food, right? And it was the government sort of procuring the food directly from the farmers and handing out the food. And when that was reformed to the food stamp program, it was a network of vouchers that were redeemable at a network of private supermarkets. So that reform we're looking at, even though the things are bundled, I think that bundling of sort of moving from government provision to vouchers redeemable at the private network is kind of the pretty common bundling that you would see of these two programs.
Okay.
Okay, so great. Any other questions on that before I kind of move on? Okay. So the vouchers, I think, thus far, the vouchers, I think, on net led to a very different allocation of aid. So substantially less inclusion error. Exclusion error increases a bit, but not by much. And the key thing is those who receive the aid receive a lot more. They also get higher quality food. And on net, this led to a substantial concentration of resources among the very poor, which in turn sort of reduced total poverty rates. And so, I think that the lesson here is that the administrative improvements from the vouchers seem to matter more than the self-selection effects from kind of providing this low quality assistance. So now what we can look at in sort of the remainder of the talk is some of those other kind of aspects of differences between sort of these two different programs that I sort of mentioned at the front that you might sort of be thinking about kind of from a price theory perspective. Like, do they change your food consumption behaviors? Does it affect equilibrium food prices? And so on. So let's start by looking at your consumption patterns. So a voucher, I think it's pretty generically true that vouchers almost always allow somewhat more flexibility for respondents. How flexible depends on the program, right? So in this case, the flexibility came from both the quality of the rice, that you could choose, what quality of rice you want, but also that you could choose rice and eggs in kind of whatever proportions that you wanted to kind of compared to a fixed government bundle of rice. So the question is, well, should this matter? So from our sort of, standard price theory hat, if people are consuming more than 10 kilos of rice anyway, even in the absence of program, you wouldn't think this should matter in terms of your consumption bundles, right? Because you're unconstrained in some sense, right? You should think of this like this rice they're giving you as like effectively cash, because you can just buy less rice from the market and buy other things instead. But in practice, we think there might be stickiness, right, somehow from this. And so we can try to look at that. So the first thing we'll just note is that in general, almost everyone is consuming more than 10 kgs of rice. So, in a place like Indonesia, rice is very popular. So this is, for example, even among kind of the poor households, if we look at the households in the in-kind areas, for example, it's not as if there's sort of a lot of bunching at sort of 10 kgs. And actually, remember, most of the ones getting the program are only getting like 3 kgs of rice, right, on average. The typical, only about 3% of households are consuming less than 10 kgs of rice per month. Okay, so I don't think we would expect kind of mechanical consumption effects, right? Because virtually all of the households are unconstrained, even in the in-kind program. So so what do we find? So we actually, interestingly, so first we're going to just look at sort of how they're choosing to spend their subsidized food. Interestingly, it's not actually that these households are actually consuming a lot more rice. Kind of on the margin, almost all that additional stuff they're consuming is coming in the form of eggs. So actually, they're consuming about the same amount of rice from the program, but they're getting these additional eggs. What is, I think, much more interesting is if we look at their total food consumption. So now we're switching kind of parts of the survey. We're looking at that 300 question kind of consumption module at the end, and just adding up the total amount of rice they're consuming and the total amount of eggs they're consuming. And the government normalizes it to grams of egg protein because you could have chicken eggs or duck eggs or whatever, and they sort of all add them up. And so what's interesting is that the total amount of egg protein consumed for these households increases, and about 1/3 of the subsidized eggs consumed is a net increase. So, right, if the total amount, if households were consuming a total amount of like 32 grams of extra rice per week, that goes up by of eggs per week. About 1/3 of that, 2/3 of that is just sort of crowding out other eggs they would have bought otherwise, and 1/3 of that is a net increase in their total consumption. And we find even stronger effects kind of for the poor. And I think one thing that's kind of interesting here is that we don't really find systematic changes on other dimensions of consumption. So, if we look at sort of, sugar, cooking oil, beef, chicken, milk, corn, salt, liquor, cigarettes, other things like that, a few of them go up, but there's some go up, some go down. There's sort of no systematic pattern there. It doesn't look like this is just like a general kind of angle curve of higher of additional protein or something. No, it really looks like kind of the government said the voucher is usable for rice and eggs, and they're actually using it on eggs, and that's sort of changing their egg consumption. So it suggests, I think, we don't have like randomized variation and like, in some places they did eggs, in some places they did chicken. Like it is what it is. But the fact that it's really that they added just this one particular good, and that's the one that goes up, I think suggests that there is people are taking advantage of the flexibility of the program that matters, but also these labeling effects may be sticky, and that actually suggests that sort of by choosing kind of what types of goods go in that bundle, the government has a potential to sort of change people's total net consumption decisions. The second kind of thing so that's on sort of the consumption patterns. A second thing we look at is what happens to kind of the prices. So if you think about what would you expect from kind of a basic price theory perspective, well, what's happening. So in the in-kind program, the government logistics agency is buying domestic rice at a fixed price. They buy it at 8,600 rupiah per kilo, which is slightly below the consumer price. So this is not a case where they're like, wildly subsidizing kind of farmers through this program or something. They're buying it at approximately market price and then using it for the program. They buy it in part within district to some extent, but also the government is moving rice around. Kind of, they have a whole logistics agency that's sort of shipping rice all over the country to make sure it's distributed to beneficiaries. You also would think that there's a very active market in trading rice in Indonesia. This is the single most important commodity in the whole country, and so you might think maybe this thing is pretty elastically supplied. Okay, so the question is, as we shift these whole districts from food to vouchers, would this affect kind of the rice market in aggregate or not? And if we did find it, where would we expect to find these changes? Well, we'd expect to find them in places where the subsidized rice market was a large share of the total rice consumed. So the switch away from the in-kind program was a large negative supply shock. Or we might think to find it in areas that are isolated where markets are not as thick, where you might think that sort of the supply is more inelastic. So we can look at both of those. So first of all, in general, so where do we get prices? We look in the consumption survey for households that are sort of sufficiently kind of that are ineligible for the programs, in the top, I think, half or something. So we're looking at basically just the prices people are paying at the prices non-beneficiaries are paying at the market in these places. That's kind of our key outcome variable. In general, we find no effect on rice prices. So remember the typical price, actually typical price paid by a household is 9,500 rupiah per kilo. We find, we can rule out effects of more than plus or minus a percent or a couple percent. So in general, this is not the case. This thing led to major price increases. And I should say this is actually one of the concerns kind of the government had here was how this would affect rice markets. And in general, we don't see much. Then of course you might think this might be heterogeneous. And so we look at it in a couple of ways. The first is we look at it based on the size of the supply shock. So whether it's kind of above it. So the supply shock we define as the total amount of rice that was being supplied to this district by the program divided by our estimate of the total amount of rice consumed in this district, which we estimate from the consumption module of the SUSINAS, of the sample survey. And so what you can see is that point estimates are positive, suggesting kind of maybe some price increase in this area, but not necessarily statistically, nothing sort of statistically significant. And even if we're there, not sort of enormous. This this is sort of not significant. If anything, it's sort of a 5% or 4%, no, 5% change in prices. The other thing we do is we look at measures of isolation. So we have a couple. So these ones are district level. Like, is the whole district getting this supply shock or not? And the second is, we look based on sort of within the district, looking at sort of more or less isolation. We can look using it at the village level of saying, like, are these villages that don't have an asphalt road, don't have a road that's always passable, you're above the median time to the district capital or above the 75th percentile to the district capital. So these are sort of measures of kind of how isolated these villages are. And, the only one that sort of really is kind of potentially significant here is being kind of really isolated in terms of time to the district capital. And so if you look at this non-parametrically, you can see kind of like, the places that are right in the center of the district have no effect. These are non-parametric treatment effects of being switched from the in-kind program to the voucher program, heterogeneous by kind of percentile of time to the district capital. And what you can see is, again, nothing for the places close to the district capital, maybe some positive effects up to sort of 300 or so for the most remote locations. So, what do we take away from this? We think on average there's kind of no effect on prices. I think the result is, not inconsistent with sort of the Kuhn et al. Result, which finds some positive price effects in kind of the really, really remote locations. But it's also kind of worth noting these price effects are really small. So, above the 70, if you take kind of this effect seriously, it's like a 3.6% increase in prices for the really remote locations. And it's worth noting that's kind of not enough to negate the sort of benefits gained from the program for the poor. So, households are purchasing about 20 kilos a month from the private market. This would imply about having to pay about 6,500 rupiah more in rice spending compared to they were getting, I think, 13,000 more increase in benefits from the program. So even in these really isolated locations, even if you take this seriously, at least for the poor households, the administrative benefits are sort of swamping the price increases. Okay. We have two other sets of things we look at. So another question we look at is this a change in corruption? So is the overall amount that sort of is reaching citizens changing? So in a previous paper studying kind of the rice program, we had looked at a program that studied kind of identification cards for this rice program at the village level. And in that program, we found that sort of mailing out these identification cards telling you kind of here was your rights of what you could receive under this program reduced leakage of the program by between 33 and 58%. So that one was, eligible households were getting more and ineligible households were not getting any less. It was just sort of, there was more rice being distributed kind of in total in the village. In this case, we actually can try to estimate the total amount going out, and actually we find there's no change here. So this program is not about like they were, rice was falling off the back of the truck or they were stealing the rice and that goes away. Like that's not what we're finding here. We find that this is basically almost entirely just a redistribution from sort of one group to another group. And actually, you can see this actually most clearly if I sort of zip back to kind of these initial results over here, which is to say, if you look at the total amount of subsidy being received here for everybody, just add the whole thing up and take averages, it's 1,300 rupiah more. on average, and the voucher was worth about 10% more, right? It was 8, 9, 10% more depending on sort of the rice price, and that looks about the same. So in some sense, the total amount going out is not changing. It's really just a redistribution from sort of this ineligible group to the eligible group. So I think that this paper, just to zip back to where I was before, this paper is not a paper, it's not like a corruption paper in the sense that this is not about sort of like reducing kind of overall like theft of rice from the program. It's really about sort of increased administrative fidelity and sort of delivering kind of assistance to the people that the government wants it to be delivered to. The final thing that we sort of look at is administrative costs. So both of these programs, to think about this from kind of a welfare perspective, you'd want to think about, are these things differentially costly to administer? And the in-kind program, both of them tells costs, but they're very different. The in-kind program, you have the costs involved in sort of taking all the rice, moving it, storing it, shipping it around, delivering it to people. And we estimate that it's actually not particularly expensive. It's about 4% of the total costs of shipping the rice. In the voucher program, we sort of, the costs instead are about the costs of sort of the debit cards or the EDC machines and sort of distributing those. And we estimate those to be about, between, depending on how you estimate them, between sort of 75 basis points and 2% of the total costs. And so despite the fact that you have this higher administrative fidelity to the program, you're doing it at sort of substantially lower cost. So I think because almost all the questions were in the chat that Rema handled and didn't take up time for the talk, I'm actually probably going to finish a little bit early so we can have a bit of time for discussion.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a few questions that have come up and I'm running behind, so you might want to take some of them.
Well, so I can't monitor the chat and talk, so I don't know, Mika, are there questions?
Yes, yes, there are like the last three. Yeah, it's last three. I don't know. I was actually going to let them like finish with the conclusion.
Okay, that's great. So let me just summarize then,
that,
and then we can take some of those questions. Great. So so what did we find here? So there's sort of we examined kind of this at-scale transition from an in-kind food assistance program to a voucher program. The key effect came from sort of, we think, from improved program administration. So voucher households were much more likely to get the full amount of the transfer rather than have it be spread to those who were ineligible. This led to the poor getting substantially more assistance and actually a reduction in poverty. The quality of rice improved because households had more choice. The program was cheaper and cheaper, and then on net we think that the administration benefits outweighed kind of the self-targeting in this context. And the final thing I was noting is that I think we also have some evidence that the type of voucher matters. And so because we find this result that we have this stickiness and increase in egg consumption, even though there's no mechanical reason for this to happen, I think that suggests that governments have the possibility of sort of nudging people to change their consumption in particular ways just by sort of what they include in this basket. So okay, so I'll leave it there, and then we can take some questions.
Great. So
Thanks.
Gabriel, do you want to start? Thank you so much, Ben. Gabriel, do you want to start, or Sam? I think both of you have the questions on prices.
Sure, thank you. Rema answered the question, but I was wondering if there may be a concern of spillovers through Bulog giving more rice to the treatment areas now that they don't need to distribute in the control.
So I don't think so, because the Bulog's budget was reduced proportionally when they switched the program over. So they just literally took the Bulog budget and they gave it to this other program. So at least there was they didn't have any budget to do that.
Simone, do you want to answer your question?
Yeah, sure. So I was wondering if you had some slides just like on the distribution of consumption or inequality, because I take the point that like more rice is going to the people that the government wanted them to go to, and like poverty goes down, but the overall treatment effects on poverty are not statistically significant. So it'd be useful to understand, like, do you think this is just sort of a precision issue? And, in fact.
Sorry, so what are you asking for, Simone? Are you asking for this?
No, I guess I was thinking more like quantile treatment effects on the distribution of consumption, right? Because if you look at that minus 0.01, if you go back to the previous slide, like the thing that I'm thinking about is, that it's not statistically significant, this 1 percentage point effect. And it would just be useful to understand, like, do you think that's a precision issue? Like, or is it there are some of these mismeasurement issues that David was raising, right? Maybe we want them to be able to deviate. And so I think looking at just like seeing the distribution of consumption overall would be helpful to kind of unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think The thing I have that's going to be closest to, I don't have what you want, I think. The thing that I have that's going to be closest is panel B here, which shows you the consumption impacts heterogeneous by your baseline poverty score. And so what you can see is that you see that sort of more and more, you see it, it's more precise if you do it in logs, but you sort of see that what's happening is actually, it's not just that you have bigger increases in consumption for those who were kind of at the bottom to begin with, right? So for this group over here, who is at the very bottom, to begin with, you have like a 5.4% increase in consumption, and it's smaller as you kind of go up the baseline distribution. So that's not quite what you're asking, but I think, I think what's happening is that the households who are poor are actually getting kind of, and by the way, it's true in levels too, although it's not quite statistically significant in levels, but it looks like what's happening is that, consistent with sort of our overall thing about the program, it's that the households who are really poor poor are actually getting the biggest bump in consumption. So I think that's kind of what's really driving those effects. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Great. I think there was, before going to the specific questions here, there was something also that Dean Yang is bringing about the conversation that Dilip brought, which I think was interesting about this. Dilip, I don't know if you want to bring it about this, that what was the key about this, if it was the elimination of the control of the local government and also the fact that the banks are not that corrupt. Dilip, I don't know if you want to add more on that, and Dean, that you have been in the conversation with.
Could we just ask the authors to respond to that question? So why?
Sorry, what was the question again?
Why did the administrative fidelity improve? It seems like that's the #1 question that's been going back and forth on the chat.
Okay, so I haven't read the chat, so
everyone is speculating and have their own theories, but we should hear what the author's theory is.
So here's my theory, and then maybe you can give you your theory too. So I think part of what's going on is I think that there's two things going on. Like I think a debit card has two important characteristics. The first is it's a pre-printed debit card with your name on it that's indivisible. Okay, so that I think gives you a very strong entitlement effect. It's not easily taken away and given to somebody else, right? Because it's got your name pre-printed on it, and it's indivisible. So it's like very natural that you're going to get the whole thing. I can't sort of easily, say I'm going to give a third of it to Rema and a third of it to me and a third of it to Abhijit. Like it's one card with your name on it. And the second thing that I think is important is that it's administered through through the remote banking agents, and they have a whole. You're sort of importing this whole set of rules and institutions around banking, which is sort of set up to sort of make sure that you give the right credits to the right people. And so, this, by the way, this over here, Mandiri, this is the biggest bank in Indonesia. This is one of the big state-owned banks. This is administered by big state-owned banks. And so, banks just have a whole set of administrative capacity around making sure the right person kind of gets the right account. And so I suspect that it was a combination of those things that led to it. Rema, do you have any additional things you want to add? Yeah.
It sounds like you're saying that in the control group under in-kind distribution, with the control over distribution being delegated to some village leadership, it just was less well targeted to the intended beneficiaries.
Well, I think what happens is in the village leadership, so you move from doing this to doing this. And when you do this, right, you deliver a bunch of food, and then somebody has to be in the local position of sort of dividing it and giving it out. And that process inherently in what you're doing doesn't have people's names on sort of the bags. It's a bag of food that's sort of more easily divisible. Doesn't have the whole banking system behind it. I think that process is what's going on. And I should say again, I think that's very similar to what happens in a lot of other countries. So for example, in the US, most states are actually implementing their food stamps program through something that looks just like this, right? You get an EDC card issued by a bank, issued by Citibank or something, and the state of Massachusetts puts your EDC thing on the card. And so it's a very sort of, I think that this, so I don't think it's like a specific to Indonesia kind of thing. I think it's kind of the way these programs tend to be implemented. Rema, is there something you wanted to add as well?
No, that's exactly what I said as well. So
I think Garance is raising the hand.
Yeah, just related to this, is it more that they don't care? Is it more that there's more pressure of people who come and say, oh, I just saw X get a bag of rice, and I, you know, he's not much poorer than me. I need my rice too. Is it some? I know you saw no difference in re-election, but maybe there's term limited versus not term limited, like re-election concern, or what makes them not care at all? They have the same list, no? They know exactly who qualifies and who does not. And I see it's divisible, but they don't need to divide it. So what makes
so
them
you're asking them sometimes what's happening in the in-kind areas and why are they doing this?
Yes.
This is a question that I have puzzled over for many years. This phenomenon of there's a lot of political pressure on these village heads to redistribute this rice more equally is something that's been going on in Indonesia for a very long time. That the central government has been fighting, trying to sort of knock down for 2 decades. And I think there's political pressure on them to do it. They sort of say, look, I'm poor too. Why aren't you giving it to me? And I think that sort of what was remarkable is that there were other things they had tried, you know, posting the list, et cetera, that didn't have these kinds of effects nearly as big as this, as just sort of handing out a card and saying, no, this is only for this is for you, and here's your card. And I think that is kind of what made the difference.
So if I could just push.
Robin, do you want to make your question? Yes.
Sorry, no, just the administrative system. In India, you know, they tried to create these bank accounts for every household. And a large part of the problem with the banks is that they don't have a list of households to start with. And then they open bank accounts for a lot of households who weren't even aware that there were bank accounts opened in their name. And then when these people go to the bank account to operate it, they don't know how to operate it. And they need some local bigwig to go with them to help them operate it, and then have to pay to bribe the local bigwig. So, you know, somehow
there's 2 things going on. There's a couple things going on here. The first is they had the list, right? From doing the sort of proxy means test program, they had a pre-period list where they had gone out and done this thing. It's not perfect by any means, but that goes back to this question that David asked of like, are you sort of like on net, it's a lot better than kind of what they were doing otherwise. And there was a process of sort of updating a list and missing exclusion error, but they had a list. That's number one. Second thing is, it is not the case that I think people are wildly sophisticated or know how to operate these things. There was actually, we're doing a separate project on this. There was sort of a savings account associated with these things. We're still investigating whether that was actively used or not. But I think what happens is you take the agent helps you sort of redistribute it. So you bring your card to the agent and you swipe it at the agent, and the agent is the one who can help you sort of administer it. So you don't actually need to be particularly savvy. You don't need to go to an ATM in the city and redeem this yourself. You know, there's someone in your village who is a neighborhood store who you deal with, and you can go deal with that. And the third thing I'll note is the government was trying to have at least 2 agents per village in order to prevent kind of there being a local monopoly. And in fact, you didn't have to go just to your village, you could go anywhere in principle. And so that they were trying to sort of prevent sort of a local monopoly to make sure that there wasn't sort of hold up by the agents. Rema, is there anything you want to add on that?
Great, thank you. Duncan, do you want to ask your question about the health effects?
Sure. So that was super interesting, incredibly valuable work. Do you have any information on what happens to total protein intake? Is this a case of egg protein being an addition to all other protein, or are people substituting from other proteins into egg? And a parallel question, do you know anything about the health outcomes of any of the beneficiaries?
I don't remember if we looked at total protein. I think it's going to be too noisy to pick up, is my memory. Do you remember, Rema?
But we did look at like other types of proteins consumed, so chicken and beef and I don't know, whatever meat people eat, and egg. The chickens are the highest type of meat people consume, the largest share, and we don't see any difference in the total amount of chicken people are eating, and we don't see for the other categories as well, although those are less common.
Although I suspect if you just put total protein on the left-hand side, I think it's going to be noisy, is my recollection. And so given that we haven't looked at health outcomes, I mean, I suppose we could, but I suspect it's going to be, the other thing is we only have a year basically between when they started treating our treatments and started treating our controls. So it's probably not going to be long enough to kind of find substantial health outcomes.
Well, if there's protein deficiency, I'm not sure that's correct. And you're quite likely to see changes in outcomes for young children. I agree with you.
Yeah, the other thing is I don't think we have that data in the SUSANAS.
But
I don't think we have that data.
You're quite likely to see effects.
Yeah,
we don't have anthropometric.
They were going to do a stunting module, and they ended up not doing it. We were very excited about that at the time, because then we would have had measurements of the kids, but in the end, it didn't get done.
Oh, too bad.
I know.
Yeah.
Thank you, Duncan. I think, Robin, you have also a question earlier, if you want to.
I guess just a general question, having read a lot of these cash versus in-kind papers over the years, I mean, this is definitely the cleanest in terms of favoring one, the voucher of the in-kind. So I'm just wondering, did you see anything that would argue in favor of keeping the in-kind system? I mean, or is it really the case that if you can make the voucher system work, for example, by identifying people and the banks work, that governments should just move to voucher systems?
I mean, at least for me, I don't see any, in this particular, I mean, there may be heterogeneity based on sort of how well the in-kind system is working in other contexts. I don't see, it seems to me, as far as I can tell, I don't see any major advantages of the in-kind system in this context, unless you explicitly had a program desirability of sort of giving it a small amount to everyone, but then you can just replicate that in the voucher system, and sort of so conditional on having an objective function that the central government has, it seems as though the voucher program is doing a better job of administering, at least as far as I can tell. Rema, do you?
I think the one thing I would think about is that there is a little bit more exclusion error, but instead of going back to the voucher system, which is much higher poverty, I would think about how do you try to reduce that exclusion error by working with the banks more closely and trying to improve the targeting in the background, is what I would think.
Yeah, I agree.
I guess, sorry, the one case for the old system would be what David McKenzie was saying, right? So if the proxy means is kind of static, whereas kind of poverty is quite stochastic, then allowing the locals to kind of, smooth allocations may be the one benefit.
Correct. So I agree with that in principle, Karthik, 100%. But there's two things. Number one, you could just do that. You could just sort of allow a more flexible dynamic updating system. And that was what Rema was saying in terms of the targeting, is you could allow, you could combine a voucher system with a more flexible on-demand application system to deal with shocks. The second point is that actually, at least in this case, it still does better even on contemporaneous consumption rather than on this baseline PMT score. So that's kind of why I felt a little more comfortable in saying it. That it's not the case that it's not the case that actually, at least in this context, it's missing it. You're right. In a case where you have, this was not a period of sort of a rapid, wild shocks to Indonesia's economy. It was a pretty constant. This is all pre-COVID.
Yeah, in fact, I agree with the results. I was just answering Robin in terms of if you had to come up with some argument, right? Like the Indian SCCC happens like once in 10 years, and that SCCC has been like incredibly sticky with regard to kind of a whole bunch of benefits, and we have no idea, how that lines up from like the 2011 classification to what it might look like on the ground now. So I think
let me say another thing. So Gaden et al. Had this paper about sort of the quantities versus prices, and sort of another thing that sort of and what they sort of argue is in a case where you have a lot of volatility in prices, fixing quantities provides you in-kind insurance. In our case, where of course you could just argue that the government could just change the value of the voucher, right? And in fact, actually, that's what happened in COVID. Actually, is that subsequent to the period we study, the government just like increased the value of the voucher, and so. But that's so if you had a case where there was tons of volatility, that's not the case here. Actually, we have very little volatility in rice prices, and so we actually do some simulations to show that actually this was sort of better, even conditional on sort of all the volatility we have in prices. So I don't think that's the case here, but in other cases where you had huge amounts of volatility, that would be something that you could think about.
Great. So we are almost running out of time, but I want Christian to make his question because he was in the line for long and I missed that one. But the rest of the participants can leave. I will stay here so that Christian can make his question. Christian?
Yeah, just wondering if if some of this could be from sort of incentives of the villagers to claim their benefits. And if the new program is perceived as, significantly more valuable, giving more choice, giving, the opportunity to buy private market rice versus accept the government product. then perhaps part of it could be more from the demand side rather than the administrative side in terms of making sure they claim their benefits as opposed to letting them lapse or whatever. Could that be part of what?
I mean, I certainly see the argument. I based on kind of my qualitative understanding of what's going on in this context, I think that's very unlikely to be the case.
Yeah, and I think we had looked at previous with this program. We had looked at if you actually give people information about the amount they're eligible for, they try to get it, and they don't succeed as much as they do in this context where you actually give them the physical debit card. But I think people want more when they know what they're actually eligible for. So I doubt that's what's happening here.
So it's not really a binding constraint in the baseline program, I guess. People not knowing or caring.
I don't think so.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben, Rema, and everyone for participating. So we will continue. Well, now there is Gather Town if you all want to join, and if not, we will continue also tomorrow at 10:30. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.